This case is truly sickening, and I'm sure you'll agree that this man, Jordan Monaghan, is pure evil. The reason for this is that Monaghan is a British serial killer who ended the lives of 2 of his 3 children between 2013 and 2016. One of them was just 28 days old. Monaghan also unsuccessfully tried to do the same to his 3rd child on 2 occasions. Whilst under investigation for these offences, Monaghan began a relationship with a woman, Evie Adams, who he abused and eventually killed in 2019 by poisoning her. All the while, Monaghan never showed any remorse for his crimes and continued to live his life as normal until he was finally revealed to be the monster that he was. Welcome to Evil Among Us. There's little information about Jordan Monaghan's early life, but it appears he was born in 1991, either in or around the town of Blackburn in the county of Lancashire, UK, approximately 20 miles northwest of Manchester. While still a teenager, Monaghan began a relationship with a girl of the same age called Laura Gray, and in November 2008, so when he was around 17 years old, Monaghan and Laura became engaged. Almost exactly 3 years later, on November the 17th, 2011, the pair welcomed their first child into the world, Logan, a happy and healthy baby boy. However, there were already issues in the relationship due to Monaghan's chronic gambling addiction, with him racking up thousands of pounds of debt on multiple credit cards and blowing all of his wages as soon as he received them. This meant the family were in significant financial difficulty, bills were unpaid, and they were in dire straits. On the 23rd of September 2012, the situation came to a head, and Laura, by now pregnant with the pair's 2nd child, told Monaghan the relationship was over. After having this conversation, Laura went on a shopping trip and then received a call from Monaghan saying that Logan had been rushed to hospital due to a suspected paracetamol overdose due to him finding Logan playing next to a pack which had some tablets missing. Laura, beside herself with worry, rushed to the hospital to be at Logan's bedside. However, when she got to the hospital, it transpired that no drugs were found in Logan's system. It had been a false alarm. Laura felt that Monaghan had just been overly cautious due to his love for their son, and this incident and his response appeared to pave over the cracks in the relationship temporarily. However, this incident was the beginning of a sick and twisted game played by Monaghan, using his own children like chess pieces in order to manipulate Laura into staying with him, but also, I believe, punishing her for daring to suggest ending the relationship. The pair welcomed their 2nd child, Ruby, on December the 8th, 2012. Laura later said that the family had the, quote, best Christmas ever after Ruby was born, and, quote, I felt like the luckiest mum in the world with my own little family. It was all I'd ever wanted. I was determined to give my children everything I never had. However, tensions continue within the relationship, with Monaghan continuing to gamble, blowing all the money he earned, whilst racking up debts and contributing nothing to the household. This led to Laura again threatening to end the relationship, and it seems that Monaghan felt he needed to escalate his behaviour to create a situation where Laura would be so utterly devastated that her focus would be redirected and she would forget about ending the relationship and would ultimately look to him for support. So he decided to murder the children. On the 28th of December 2012, Ruby, aged 20 days old, was taken to hospital due to difficulty breathing. She was diagnosed as suffering from bronchitis and stayed in hospital until the 31st of December 2012, when she was allowed home. Literally, just a few hours later, in the early hours of January the 1st, 2013, Laura was woken up by Monaghan, who said that Ruby had stopped breathing. Laura stated, quote, I ran downstairs and I could see, the moment I looked at her, that she was gone. Laura was unfortunately correct. An ambulance was called, but there was nothing that could be done. And so, baby Ruby, aged just 28 days old, was pronounced dead at 2:45 a.m. The cause of death was determined to have been due to bronchitis. However, the truth is that Monaghan had smothered Ruby in her Moses basket whilst Laura was asleep. Monaghan had clearly ensured that she was dead before waking Laura, meaning that his pathetic and disgusting pantomime of performing CPR on his daughter was just a performance likely to make him seem like a father desperately trying to save his daughter's life rather than the one who had taken it. Laura fell to pieces after the death of her daughter and relied heavily on Monaghan to get through this grief, with him taking care of the funeral arrangements and generally being her rock. Of course, the focus became on trying to come to terms with the death of their daughter, and the issues in the relationship seemed to evaporate. Laura later stated, quote, "He just carried on, but again, I just thought that he was being strong for me. I didn't suspect a thing. We focused on Logan because he was all we had left. Jordan had a really close relationship with his son." However, again the same pattern re-emerged, and Monaghan continued to gamble, resulting in tensions in the relationship. On the 16th of August 2013, Laura again had had enough of Monaghan and told him the relationship was over. The next day, the 17th of August 2013, Monaghan said he wanted to take their son Logan, now aged 21 months, swimming. Monaghan took Logan to Waves Water Fun Centre in Blackburn, but neither of them actually went swimming. In the changing rooms, Monaghan suffocated Logan. Then, in an act of ultimate depravity, he secured his son's dead body into his buggy, covered it with a rain cover, and wheeled it home. Claimed that Logan was asleep and that Laura should wake him up before he went out to get pizza. Laura said that as soon as she lifted the rain cover, she knew Logan was dead. She called Monaghan in a frantic state, and he rushed home and again made a show of performing CPR on the child he had murdered. However, Logan was beyond saving and was pronounced dead. His cause of death was determined to be inconclusive. Laura was so distraught that she had to be admitted to a psychiatric facility. However, Monaghan came to visit her every day, and she leaned on him exclusively to try and get through a parent's worst nightmare. The support led them to rekindle their relationship, and again, all his financial recklessness was forgotten. Sickeningly, after the death of Logan, Monaghan gave at least one interview to the press in which he stated, quote, "It's been like a bad dream, and we expect to wake up at any moment. You never get over losing a child, but we were just starting to move on and then Logan dies. You always expect your children to outlive you and don't think you'll have to plan their funeral, but we had to do it twice in 8 months. It's heartbreaking." He also complained that police were treating him and Laura like criminals. The couple's third child, a daughter, was born in May 2016. It appears that this child, who cannot be named for legal reasons, was again harmed by Monaghan, but thankfully survived despite his best efforts. Specifically, at the girl's christening on the 18th of September 2016, Laura caught Monaghan using a fruit machine, and this led to an argument where she said she would leave him. On the 27th of September 2016, Monaghan was alone with his daughter when he shouted to Laura that she'd stop breathing. An ambulance was called, but the child appeared to recover on their own. On the 2nd of October 2016, their daughter again suffered another apparent respiratory episode whilst alone with Monaghan. She spent 9 days recovering, but no cause for her sudden illness was found in the hospital. Later, it was proven that Monaghan had suffocated his daughter on each of these occasions, attempting to murder her. After this last incident, the relationship between Laura and Monaghan broke down permanently, and I've read alternatively that Laura was given full custody of their third child, but also read that they were taken into care. Either way, Monaghan had no access to his daughter, inevitably saving her life. The deaths of 2 children and the serious illness of another within the same household led to serious concerns amongst professionals, but it was not until January 2018, almost 5 years after the children's deaths, that investigations between the police and medical professionals determined the most likely cause of these incidents was deliberate obstruction of the children's airways. It was then not until April the 13th, 2018, that Jordan Monaghan was arrested on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. This clip shows part of the interview, specifically related to the death of Logan.
You're under arrest, obviously, on suspicion of attempted murder of Logan. That's following instance on the 27th of the 7th, 2013. That's attempt and a murder on the 17th of the 8th, 2013. Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds it was before. You're responsible for either of those two offences.
No.
But he was away when you left Wales.
It was no. Not when I left.
He wasn't awake. When did he fall asleep?
Just as we was coming out of Wales.
The police didn't have enough evidence to charge Monaghan, and he was released on bail. However, it appears they kept a close eye on him. This included reaching out to women that he tried to start relationships with, informing them that he was a dangerous man. Unfortunately, this did not stop Monaghan from forming a relationship with a woman called Evie Adams in early 2018, when she was just 22 years old. Evie Adams did not have the best start in life, being removed from an abusive household with her brother when she was young, with both children being the victims of violence and neglect. When she was around 7 years old, the fostering agency called Evie Adams and asked if she and her husband Bernard would take the children, to which they agreed, and the pair never left, being loved by Bernard and Yvonne as if they were their own children. And 3 years after first arriving, they were both adopted. At the age of 16 years old, Evie took their surname, cementing her place as their daughter. Around the same time, Evie moved out and began a relationship with her first serious boyfriend, Nathan. And when Evie was around 19 years old, she became pregnant with her first child, a daughter. Unfortunately, she suffered postnatal depression after the birth, and this put a strain on her relationship with Nathan, and they separated, but they would co-parent their daughter, with her spending certain days with her father at his property. However, it appears that Evie was lonely and didn't wish to raise her daughter alone, and she began looking online for a new partner. In early 2018, Evie and Jordan Monaghan met through Tinder and began a relationship. Monaghan sought to control and isolate Evie almost immediately, telling her not to inform people that the pair were together, with her family only finding out because they heard local gossip about the fact he'd been seen at her house. Her parents and friends were concerned, as Monaghan was believed, within the local community, correctly, to be a child murderer, and they begged Evie to end the relationship, but tragically, she dismissed their concerns. Monaghan started to sever connections that Evie had with support, including her friends and also her former partner Nathan, with him threatening to burn down his house if he carried on contacting Evie, and that he didn't care if the pair's daughter was in the property when this happened. However, Evie quickly fell under his spell, taken in by Monaghan's charm, being made to feel special and no longer alone. Monaghan subtly chipped away at Evie's self-esteem, reminding her that she'd been abused as a child and therefore somehow damaged, and that she would not be able to find anyone else if they were not together. The police and social services entered the scene almost immediately, with the police warning Evie the danger she and her daughter were in, as well as taking her to a place of safety. Social services basically gave Evie a choice of being with Monaghan or having her daughter removed from her care, and she initially appeared to agree to stop seeing him, and a restraining order was imposed in May 2018, prohibiting Monaghan from having contact with Evie. However, Monaghan ignored this order, and the pair kept having contact, leading to him breaching the order repeatedly, including in June 2018, December 2018, and March 2019. He appeared in front of the courts for each of these breaches, and eventually went to prison for 12 weeks after the last breach. However, it's clear that he had no intention of relinquishing control over Evie. Due to the continued contact between the pair, in early 2019, Evie lost custody of her daughter, with the child being removed due to concerns that Monaghan would harm or kill them. Evie was devastated, and while she still had regular supervised contact with her daughter, it clearly wasn't the same. By mid-2019, it appears Evie was looking for a way out of the relationship with Monaghan and wanted to make changes so that she could have her daughter returned to her care. With the help of services, Evie was able to gain a place in a women's refuge in Kendal, approximately 50 miles away. The locations of women's refuges are closely guarded secrets for obvious reasons, as these women are often escaping from men who, if they could track them down, would likely kill them. However, Monaghan found Evie's location quickly, likely due to tracking her phone, and she contacts a friend telling her that Monaghan was following her around everywhere she went. She was advised to call the police, but she didn't want to get Monaghan into further trouble. However, despite all attempts, Monaghan would find a way to continue to slither his way back into Evie's life. By October 2019, the pair were back in a relationship, but it appears that Evie was fighting back, showing defiance of Monaghan's control, which led to more frequent arguments. The tipping point appears to have come over the weekend of the 11th to the 13th of October 2019, when Monaghan, Evie and some friends went to stay in a caravan in Blackburn. Monaghan didn't hide the person he was. He was rude, aggressive, intimidating, and eventually smashed up the caravan they were all staying in. When they returned back to Blackburn on the 14th of October 2019, Evie appears to have told Monaghan that the relationship was over, as she began to look for a new place to live, away from him. However, Monaghan had no intention of allowing this to happen, and on the same day, he joined a WhatsApp group titled, quote, UK Tablets, and sent a message to buy drugs saying, quote, who's got tramadol, and asking others for, quote, pregabs and blues, meaning diazepam and pregabalin. Tramadol is a strong painkiller, whilst diazepam and pregabalin are medications used for a variety of conditions, but when taken with tramadol can cause drowsiness, sedation, and slow breathing and heart rate, potentially resulting in death. Within days, Evie's flat hunting had been placed on hold. She was reportedly being extremely unwell. It appears that Monaghan was poisoning Evie, giving her high doses of a combination of these drugs, which has a severe and rapid impact on her body. By October the 22nd, 2019, Evie was delirious and suffering from abdominal pains. Her body was shutting down. Her breathing was also getting slower, along with her heart rate. In one of the last messages Evie sent to Monaghan on the 23rd of October 2019, she stated, quote, I feel like I'm dying. Unfortunately, she was correct, and her life was ebbing away, and it's horrific to think how scared she must have been, going from active and healthy to dying within the space of approximately 2 weeks and not knowing the reason why. On the 24th of October 2019, Evie Adams had extremely high levels of sedative in her system, was in significant pain, and was unable to walk. Monaghan then administered a fatal dose of tramadol, intended to kill her. He gave her a dosage equivalent to 20 50-milligram tramadol tablets. This dosage is approximately 3 times the amount that a doctor would usually ever prescribe of this powerful painkiller, and this, combined with the residual sedatives in her body, resulted in an overdose and her death at the age of just 23 years old. Whether Monaghan stood and watched Evie die is unclear, but it's apparent that he was taking steps to cover his tracks immediately. After administering this fatal dosage to Evie, he took her phone and went to work. He then sent himself a message from her phone, which read, quote, I've taken the drugs. I don't want to be here anymore. I don't want help. Clearly laying the groundwork to make her death look like a suicide. As with other people like Monaghan, they appear to have real difficulty in understanding how people would actually react in this situation. Because they lack normal human emotions, they act in a strange way, which actually raises suspicion. In the case of Monaghan, instead of dropping everything and running home to be with his partner, who had just texted him saying she was going to kill herself, he finished his working day and texted her aunt, asking her to check up on Evie. Evie's aunt Julie went round there and found her niece dead in bed. Given the fact that a young woman had died suddenly, the police were called and began an investigation. But, whilst they were suspicious, they could not be sure Evie's death was suspicious. It was actually Monaghan's own arrogance and stupidity which raised concerns and led police to take a closer look at him. Specifically, a few weeks after her death, in November 2019, Monaghan told police that he'd found a suicide note. This was apparently hidden in a picture frame, which he'd found when he took the photo out to apparently place in Evie's coffin. This was considered very odd, as the note, which as a suicide note was clearly intended to be read, was put in a place where it could potentially have never been found, and it was just by chance that Monaghan had happened to open that one picture frame. Also, the handwriting did not match Evie's. An autopsy established that Evie's death was due to a fatal overdose, and Monaghan was interviewed on suspicion of killing her in both October 2019 and June 2020. He denied having anything to do with her death. Unfortunately, again, the police didn't have enough evidence to charge him, and so he was released on bail. Monaghan pretended to be the grieving boyfriend, including posting this disgusting post on Facebook. So, by 2020, Jordan Monaghan was on bail, whilst the police investigated his potential involvement in the murders of 3 people. So, what did Monaghan do? He went back to his old lifestyle of gambling and drinking, and this disgusting clip from around October 2020, so a year after Evie's death, shows him apparently having the time of his life, filming himself singing along to the song Mr. Brightside by The Killers. Due to that being a copyrighted song, I can't play the sound, but you're not missing much. The breakthrough in this case came in late 2020 when the police were able to obtain Monaghan's phone, and this showed him buying the very drugs that Evie had overdosed on just before she started to become unwell. On the 17th of January 2021, the walls finally closed in on Monaghan, and he was arrested on suspicion of murdering Logan, Ruby and Evie Adams, as well as 2 counts of attempting to murder his 3rd child. He continued to deny any involvement, and when confronted with the new evidence about the search on his phone of him trying to source drugs, he said they were for him. He was not believed, and on the 18th of January 2021, Monaghan was charged with all offences and remanded into custody to await his day in court. Jordan Monaghan pleaded not guilty to all offences and went to trial at Preston Crown Court. This trial lasted 10 weeks, and on December the 17th, 2021, the jury found him guilty of murdering Logan and Ruby by suffocating them and Evie Adams by administering a fatal dosage of medication. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder against his 3rd child with Laura Gray by suffocating them. Later that same day, Monaghan stood before Mr. Justice Goose for sentencing. Justice Goose stated, quote, "It's difficult to imagine why you carried out these offences, but having listened to the evidence in this trial, I'm sure that you are an exceptionally controlling, selfish and cruel man." He then sentenced him. For 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, Jordan Monaghan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 40 years. On the 29th of July 2022, this was increased to a minimum of 48 years when the Court of Appeal deemed the original sentence to be too lenient. Based on this, Monaghan will be around 77 years old before he's able to apply for parole, assuming he lives that long. Concerns have been raised to the media about the handling of this case by several different agencies, including medical professionals, and their lack of, quote, professional curiosity regarding the deaths of both Logan and Ruby, with their deaths not being treated as suspicious. I've also read about a serious case review being initiated at Blackburn Council, inevitably around safeguarding, and why the family was not scrutinised more closely when the children have repeated contact with medical professionals, and why consideration wasn't given to removing the children from the home. In addition, criticism has been levelled at the speed of the police investigation, with Monaghan not being charged with the murders of his own children until 8 years later, and 3 years after a review had established that his 2 children had likely been murdered by suffocation. In response, Detective Chief Superintendent Pauline Stables stated, quote, The deaths of both Ruby and Logan were subject to review in 2018. We gathered all the information the previous investigation filed. It's really difficult. You've got a loss of evidence from previous investigations because the deaths were treated or deemed to be natural causes. You've got medical evidence that's lost, CCTV, so it's really difficult to investigate historical crimes. Loss of evidence related to the suspicious death of 2 children. I'm not sure about you, but I find this explanation absolutely staggering. The glacial progression in this case and the lack of action by agencies meant that Jordan Monaghan was free to murder another person, a vulnerable woman whose death has devastated her family and left a daughter without a mother. Monaghan should have been safely behind bars a lot sooner, and lives would have been saved. Serious case reviews should result in a report, which can be accessed by the public. I cannot find any. Potentially they are pending, and I'll likely do an update on this video if I can get hold of them, as they often contain a lot more information, including background regarding the offender. However, even without this information, I for one am struggling to understand how a man this dangerous was allowed to walk around free for so long, free to kill again. This is one of the most horrific cases I've covered, and in order to highlight why, we need to look at why Jordan Monaghan committed these crimes. It should be pointed out that Monaghan did not admit his culpability, and the trial established his guilt, but not his motivation. So this is just my analysis, but I'm very confident I'm on the mark. So, going back to the profile of domestic abusers, these individuals often have backgrounds of trauma themselves, which results in them having low self-esteem and issues with abandonment, and they're unable to cope with the end of a relationship and or being on their own, and so they look to control their partners, eroding their self-esteem and placing them in a position, often through fear, where they feel unable to leave. Control is obtained and maintained through a variety of tactics, including violence, threats of violence, emotional abuse, isolating behaviour, etc. If they feel their control is being defied, for example, if their victim tries to leave the relationship, they will implement whatever tactics to stop this, as well as punish them for daring to consider that they have any say in the coupling. So, that is the basic template, which I found is common amongst domestic abusers. But in the case of Monaghan, there are additional factors I think need to be considered, in particular indicators of narcissism and psychopathy. Specifically, I think that Monaghan is a man who is entirely self-centered. No one else matters but him and what he wants, and, in this case, remaining in a relationship. With regards to psychopathy, I think it's obvious that he has no empathy, no compassion for others, and is willing to harm anyone, even his own children, without any regret or remorse. So, together, you have a man who is emotionally dependent on relationships and is willing to do whatever it takes in order to remain in control in these situations, even if it involves harming and killing others to get his own way. This would explain why, whenever Laura Gray tried to end a relationship, he would not have this, as I looked for some way to ensure this would not occur. He figured that the best way to do this was to create some sort of emergency which would completely redirect Laura's attention away from concerns about his behaviour, and he decided on using the one thing most precious to her, but clearly of absolutely no consequence to him, their children. So he created situations where she was in a blind panic when the children were sick, and he would then ride on his white Charger, pretending to be supportive and caring, being her rock. However, he needed situations which would utterly devastate Laura, destroy her psychologically, make her look to him entirely for support, and give him further opportunities to act as the hero. In order to achieve this, he killed the children, knowing that this would cripple Laura and make her forget any intention to leave him, and give him opportunities to act as the hero, including CPR on children he knew to be already dead, and organising a funeral, etc. So, rather than taking steps to address the main issue which seemed to be causing issues in the relationship, his gambling, he thought it was a better idea to kill his own children. The absolute evil of this man is so profound, and I cannot get my head around how he could kill his own children, likely by placing his hand over their nose and mouth, watching and feeling their life ebbing away, abusing the ultimate trust that is placed in a parent by a child, and destroying the most precious gift that a person can receive in their life. These children were just pawns in his sick little game. He was no father. He's not even worthy of being referred to as a human being, in my opinion. I think there was also a form of punishment in his actions. It's sickening that he wheeled Logan home knowing he was dead, and they got Laura to lift the rain cover and see her son like that. I have no doubt Monaghan was filled with glee, knowing the impact this would have on her, and he was likely thinking to himself, "So you think you can leave me? This is what happens when you try." Eventually, he formed a relationship with Evie Adams, a woman who had a history of trauma herself, who was struggling as a single mother, and who just wanted to be loved and supported. No doubt, Monaghan presented himself as her saviour and manipulated her into believing that he was the answer to all of her problems. The one positive in this case, and I use that term loosely, is that Evie's daughter was removed from her care, and this is only because I have no doubt that Monaghan would have harmed or killed this child eventually. However, in the absence of anyone else, he targeted Evie directly, and when she wanted to end the relationship, he poisoned her. Initially, I think this was to incapacitate her, making her so ill that she was entirely under his control. Why he eventually killed her is unclear, but I think that Monaghan knew he could not let her recover, that if she did, she would tell the police who was giving her the pills, and it would only be a matter of time before he was arrested. She was an inconvenience and needed to be eliminated. Why Evie took the pills is also a question that remains unanswered, but I think it's important to note that during the Blackpool trip in October 2019, one of her friends noticed Monaghan giving her tablets out of a bottle. I think it's likely that Monaghan had already got Evie hooked on medication as a form of control, and so she would be more likely to continue taking pills he gave her, potentially due to already being addicted to them. I want to say something in this case to try and offset some potential negative comments. People may say, why did Laura or Evie not know what was going on? Or why did they not take better care of their children, etc.? I really want to stress that unless you have been in this type of situation or seen it up close, it's difficult to put into words how insidious domestic abuse is, how these men are often skilled manipulators who can change people and make them act in ways that, looking back, they may be completely disgusted by. Even if you think both women potentially should or could have acted differently, I don't think that anything that either of them did meant that one should lose their life at the age of 23 years old and the other one had to spend the rest of her life mourning her two children. Nothing they did or didn't do meant they deserved that. So, please be respectful of these women. Do not lose focus that this monster, Jordan Monaghan, is the ultimate cause of this. May he rot in prison and then, hopefully, in the depths of hell. On another note, I want to highlight support services if you need to talk to someone about domestic abuse. In the UK, a great place to start for advice and help, especially with escaping an abusive relationship, is to call the National Domestic Abuse Helpline 24 hours a day on 0808 2000 24/7. Also, Women's Aid is an amazing organisation that offers advice and practical support, and they can be found at www.womensaid.org.uk. The website has lots of information, as well as a live chat function, which is active between 8 AM and 6 PM Monday to Friday, and 10 AM to 6 PM at the weekend. There's an option you can click on the website, which quickly takes you to a Google home screen if you need to hide what you're doing from your abuser. In the US, call the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence on 1-800-799-SAFE or visit www.thehotline.org. The advantage of this website is that if you double-click escape, it takes you to a Google homepage, which will mean you can hide what you're doing if you're disturbed by your abuser. The link to both websites will be in the description. However, if you or someone you know is in immediate danger, then do not hesitate to call 999 or 911 or whatever the emergency service number is in your country. Javed Iqbal was a Pakistani serial killer, paedophile and child rapist who claimed to have killed 100 boys in a 12-month period between 1998 and 1999. He strangled his victims and then dissolved their bodies in acid. his self-proclaimed kill count makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. And whilst there are some doubts about his number of victims, it's clear he ended the lives of many children and was proud of his crimes. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Most sources state that Javed Iqbal was born in 1956 in Lahore, the second largest city in Pakistan, but other years of birth mentioned include 1961. He was the sixth of 8 children to his businessman father Muhammad, and the family, who observed the Muslim faith, was quite well off. Iqbal showed violent, self-entitled and manipulative behaviour as a child, with one of his brothers stating, quote, "As a boy, he was violent and eccentric. He would give a lot of headache to our parents." Another brother said that if his parents ever refused his demands, he would threaten to hurt himself until he got what he wanted. Iqbal himself said that during his childhood, he first began having fancies about killing people. As a young man, Iqbal was described as arrogant, an individual consumed with his own self-importance, and he would regularly boast about his alleged ties to politicians and other famous people in Pakistan. He was desperate to give people the impression that he was part of high society and therefore better than them. Iqbal knew he was gay from a young age, something his conservative Muslim family refused to acknowledge, but it appears that this was a well-known secret. Iqbal's feelings of rejection and anger about not being able to openly indulge his sexual interest in males built up inside of him, and his resentment against society began to fester. Iqbal did marry twice in his life, even having a daughter, but it appears that these marriages were to stop rumours about his behaviour from spreading. However, when he got to his 20s, it became clear that Iqbal was not interested in men, but little boys, and he would go to great lengths in order to find victims. This was a time well before the internet, and people used adverts in magazines and newspapers in order to find people to speak to find pen pals, and Iqbal was one of these individuals. He put adverts in the Altair magazine, specifically stating he wanted to talk to people. It's not clear what his advert specifically said, but it was like they were geared towards ensuring that the majority of those writing to him were children. I believe on one occasion, he said he wanted someone to write to about collecting stamps. Those children who did write to him would receive letters written in colourful pens, clearly to make them more attractive to a child. Iqbal would send money to the children in his letters in exchange for photographs of them, but also asking them to meet him. Whilst it was only a small amount of money, it was likely more than these children had ever seen, and many of them went to his property unaccompanied and were molested by Iqbal. In the neighbourhood where he lived, he quickly gained a reputation as a paedophile, and parents would keep their children as far away from him as possible, but this did not stop Iqbal from luring children from outside of the immediate area. A man who lived in the area said, quote, "It was an open secret. Everyone knew he molested young boys." Iqbal's family received numerous complaints about his paedophilia, but they were able to pay the families off. This seems to have emboldened Iqbal, and he became more brazen. In 1990, he lured a 9-year-old boy off the streets into his home and raped him. The boy's parents called the police and filed a report. He was arrested for sodomy. However, Iqbal was able to pay the police off, and the charge was dropped. Iqbal then opened an arcade in the early 1990s, which was a magnet for local children. He would spoil them, and an adult who used to go there as a child later stated, quote, "He spent lavishly on kids. He would buy us firecrackers. He even built fish aquariums and enclosures for snakes for the entertainment of neighbourhood kids." Children would flock to the arcade day and night, and Iqbal took full advantage of his constant stream of victims. He would drop a 100 rupee note on the floor, which is just under £1 or just over $1 in today's money. He would then watch which child picked it up and announce that his money had been stolen. He would then say he needed to search the boys. Once the money had been found on the boy who picked it up, he would be accused of being a thief and told to go with Iqbal into a different room, assumedly for punishment or a talking to. In this room, the boy would be anally raped and often told they could keep the money to buy their silence. Iqbal did this repeatedly. Eventually, word spread amongst the area and parents stopped letting their children go to the arcade. However, Iqbal was undeterred and set up an aquarium, a gym, and even a school, all with the intention of attracting young boys that he could molest. It's clear that Iqbal was a committed paedophile who would use family money to set up ventures to indulge his deviant sexual interest in little boys. Things got worse in 1993 when his father died and Iqbal received a significant amount of inheritance money. Iqbal would spend lavishly, including building a large house in Rana town in 1995, where he would often be seen with young boys who would invite over and no doubt molest. Eventually, Iqbal opened another arcade in order to continue to gain access to young boys and to rape them. In February 1998, a report was received from the police. They'd lured 2 young boys from the Das Darbar shrine in Lahore, taken them to a remote location, and raped them at gunpoint. Iqbal was again able to pay the police off and was not charged. On another occasion, Iqbal raped a child from an upper-class family. The matter was taken to the elders of the area, and Iqbal was forced to write a letter saying he wouldn't do it again. And this note was circulated around the area, and Iqbal was made to visit about 100 local businesses to apologise as penance for his crimes. However, his luck ran out in September 1998, when Iqbal was beaten severely by 2 children, including one who worked at the arcade. Iqbal was beaten so badly that he received severe head injuries and was unconscious for 22 days at Lahore General Hospital. Whilst he was unconscious, a child's family made a complaint of rape to the police, and, due to not being around to try and bribe his way out of it, when he regained consciousness, he was arrested on a charge of sodomy, but bailed. None of Iqbal's family were willing to pay for his medical treatment, so he had to pay for this out of his own pocket, and he lost his expensive house and cars and was essentially penniless. When he was released from hospital, he had weeks of recovery ahead and was unable to walk properly without assistance. He was forced to move into a run-down property in a slum near the Ravi Road in Lahore, and his aging mother took care of him. I found no real information about his mother, but she and Iqbal were apparently close, but she soon died of a heart attack, and Iqbal linked this directly to the stress of the police daring to arrest him for raping children. The death of his mother appears to have been the straw that broke the camel's back, and Javed Iqbal decided to get revenge against society by killing 100 male children. He wanted revenge against the police, who would dare to arrest him for raping children, and so would show how cunning he was by committing murders right under their noses. He wanted children to be punished because they dared to report his behaviour to the police, and also attacked him, despite it being highly likely that those who assaulted him were children he had raped or attempted to rape. However, most of all, he wanted revenge for his mother's death, with him later confessing after his arrest, quote, "My mother cried for me. I wanted 100 mothers to cry for their children." Between approximately December 1998 and December 1999, Javed Iqbal put his sickening plan into action. Javed Iqbal showed a high level of planning in order to commit the murders. He'd apparently continued to fixate on murder throughout his adulthood, and had mentioned to others that he felt he could commit the perfect murder by dissolving the bodies of his victims in acid. So Iqbal bought a number of barrels of hydrochloric acid and stored them in his home, which would also be the place where the children would be murdered. Iqbal also had accomplices. He shared his home with 3 boys, Sajid Ahmad, age 17, Mamad Nadim, age 15, and Mamad Sabir, aged just 13 years old. There was also a 4th accomplice called Muhammad Ishaq, but I cannot find any information on him. These boys were so-called street children, those who were orphaned and had no family, or those whose family were extremely impoverished, so their children would take to the streets to try and make money any way they could. This included selling items on the streets, but a terrible profession that some of these, often very young children, were forced into was giving massages to men, which would inevitably end with sexual contact. Iqbal offered his accomplices money to bring in boys, which enabled them to be able to avoid this type of life, but only by victimizing others. The victims came from this same marginalized and often forgotten part of the population, and, using his accomplices' local knowledge, it was not difficult to find a steady stream of vulnerable children who were lured to Iqbal's apartment. Many of the victims were targeted at the Hira Mandi Bazaar and the Data Darbar Shrine, both in Lahore. The children would be lured to Iqbal's property and, when inside, he would rape them, strangle them with a chain, and then dismember them, with a piece of their body then being dissolved in vats of acid. The remnants of these bodies would then be dumped, likely by being poured down a drain. The youngest victim was 6 years old, the oldest, 16. Iqbal would take the children's clothes and shoes and label them, often using a photo he had taken of the children just prior to his murder. This was his collection of trophies. I've struggled to find information on Iqbal's victims, but I have found information about 2 brothers, although the name of only one is mentioned and neither's age is documented. One of these brothers escaped with his life, the other tragically did not, and their story gives an idea of how the gang operated to lure children into Iqbal's clutches. In October 1999, Ijaz Muhammad, lovingly known as Kaka by his family, and his older brother went out to try and make money. They were both masseurs and would walk the streets hanging out in parks, clinking together bottles of ointment in the hopes of attracting customers which, as already outlined, would usually be paedophilic men. Kaka's brother said they were in the park in Lahore when they were approached by 2 boys not much older than them. They told them, quote, "Our boss needs a massage and he'll pay you double the price if you come with us." The brothers followed the pair until they were outside Iqbal's property. Kaka was told to go inside as the boss, Iqbal, was waiting to speak to him. Kaka's brother then left to try and find other customers. Kaka was never seen alive again. How many children Iqbal actually killed is disputed, and I'll return to this later, but regardless of the true number, it's clear that he was a prolific child murderer, and none of his crimes were noticed until he himself confessed, which he actually had to do twice before anyone actually bothered to do anything about it. In November 1999, a letter was received by Lahore police station, which was a confession, with the author stating they'd killed 100 boys. A few officers went to the address on the note, Iqbal's home, and knocked on the door. When he answered, he was agitated and abusive, and at one point, pulled out a gun and began threatening the officers, saying he would shoot himself if they didn't leave him alone. So, what did they do in this situation? Did they bundle him to the floor, arrest him, and search the property? No, they simply walked away. In December 1999, Javed Iqbal mailed the same letter, along with dozens of pictures of boys he'd murdered, to the offices of Jang, Pakistan's most popular Urdu language newspaper. This landed on the desk of the editor, Jamal Chisti, who later stated, quote, "After going through the contents of the envelope, I thought there could be 2 possibilities. Either someone was trying to frame him, or this man has really done it." Jamil and a colleague took it upon themselves to investigate, and they, like the police a month before, went to Iqbal's property. It was abandoned and padlocked. The 2 journalists scaled an outside wall in order to gain entry. What they found inside was like something out of a nightmare. They saw bloodstains all over the floor and walls, and noticed blood on a chain, the same one used to strangle the victims. There were sacks scattered around the floor, as well as a journal, with placards neatly pinned to the wall explaining what they'd found like some sick museum exhibit. One placard read, quote, "The 5 sacks lying in one corner of this room contain the clothes of 100 victims, while the remaining 3 contain 85 pairs of shoes belonging to them. All details of the murders are contained in the diary and the 32-page notebook that had been placed in the room. This is my confessional statement." Another read, quote, "I've decided to commit suicide." There was a distinct smell of decomposition, which seemed to be emanating from 2 barrels in the property. One of these was opened and found to contain human body parts which had been dissolved. Later, it would be determined that the barrels contained a human torso, as well as 2 feet amputated at the ankle. They were determined to be the remains of 3 different children who had been dead for some time. A placard on the wall near the barrels stated, quote, "The bodies in this room have deliberately not been disposed of, so that the authorities will find them after my suicide." Also found in the property were bags and bags of human hair, clearly taken from the heads of the victims due to how long this would take to dissolve in acid. This point, and the whole setup, indicates that Iqbal had set up a production line of murder and dismemberment, with him having researched every aspect of how to achieve his horrific objective of killing 100 boys as quickly as possible. It appears that he achieved this in approximately 12 months. Jamil and his colleague began investigating what they'd found. Using the notebook they recovered, they were able to contact the families of children Iqbal had claimed to have murdered, and they were able to establish that these children had indeed disappeared. On December the 3rd, 1999, the story was published on the front page under the headline, quote, "Claim of murder of 100 kids," with 57 pictures of the murdered children being published on the front page, many of them smiling, not knowing about their impending horrific fate. Publication of this story caused understandable chaos, and parents of missing children descended on the area, clutching photographs of their babies. Then, and only then, did the police actually do anything. They recovered the barrels from the property and sent them off for examination. They also collected all the shoes and clothing and laid them out in an evidence room, whilst grieving parents had to pour through these piles, looking for items belonging to their children. Absolutely horrific. The police then began looking for Iqbal and his accomplices. His 4 accomplices were found first, having been arrested when they tried to cash a stolen traveller's cheque. However, whilst in custody, one of these, Mohammed Ishaq, apparently committed suicide by jumping out of a window whilst being questioned. From what I've read, suspects of particularly heinous crimes having accidents or committing suicide were quite common in this part of the world at this time, and was a poor attempt at a cover-up when these people were murdered or assisted out of the window by being thrown. Iqbal was nowhere to be found, but the police didn't have to look for him for long. On the 30th of December 1999, Javed Iqbal walked into the newspaper office of Jang and gave himself up. At the time, legal proceedings in Pakistan were usually held behind closed doors, but the court case against Javed Iqbal and his accomplices was widely covered by the cameras. Despite his confession, it's clear that Iqbal wanted things on his terms. He wanted attention and praise for what he'd done, but he didn't want to suffer the consequences of his actions, and so, despite writing a 30-plus page confession and leaving signs above all of the evidence, he claimed he was innocent of the offences. His claims were laughable. On one occasion, he said his confession about killing 100 boys was simply to bring attention to the plight of Pakistan's impoverished child population. Seriously? I mean, I don't even know where to start with that one. He also claimed that despite the remains found in the barrels in his home being identified as human bodies, the dismembered remains of children, he claimed they were simply full of beef and other meat as a way to confuse the police. Iqbal made long, rambling statements in court, which made little sense, including him saying, quote, "I was considered an insane person, but I beg that my viewpoint must also be heard. I considered myself a culprit because I have been made a culprit by police. So I think what he's saying here is that he confessed the crimes because the police told him he was the one responsible. Right." Inevitably, Iqbal and his accomplices were found guilty, and on March 16, 2000, stood to be sentenced before Judge Ranja. 13-year-old Mahmoud Sabir was sentenced to 63 years in prison. 15-year-old Mahmoud Nadim was sentenced to 182 years in prison. 17-year-old Sajid Ahmad was sentenced to death by hanging. As for Javed Iqbal, he was sentenced to death and then some. The judge ordered that he be strangled publicly in the street in front of the families of his victims. His body would then be cut into 100 pieces and dissolved in acid, exactly the way he had murdered so many children. However, despite this sentence being, in my opinion, quite fitting, it quickly caused an uproar amongst human rights activists and was appealed. It was determined that this sentence was abhorrent and could not be carried out. So, a new sentence date was set for the middle of October 2001, but Javed Iqbal would never attend this. On October the 9th, 2001, both individuals sentenced to death, Javid Iqbal and Sajid Ahmad, were found dead in their respective cells in prison. The official report was that they died by poisoning themselves. However, autopsies of both found they had clear signs of strangulation and a pattern of injuries suggesting they'd both been beaten at the time of their deaths and in the weeks and months before. I think it's pretty clear that the prison guards or prisoners, or both, took matters into their own hands with this one, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. Before talking about the profile of Javid Iqbal, an important issue is why he was able to get away with this for so long. Iqbal's crimes only came to light when he confessed. He claimed that he could have killed 500 if he wanted to. I think this is true. The police just didn't care. Why is that? Central to this is the inefficiency and corruption in the police, which had an impact on them actually bothering to investigate anything, the parents of the murdered children even feeling they were able to report their loved ones missing. The reason for this, from my research, was the rampant corruption and extortion happening in the police. Victims' families were scared to go to the authorities, for fear they would be shaken down and what little they had taken from them. They also knew that nothing would be done. As they came from poor families, their problems simply didn't matter. This is why only 25 of the 100 children who went missing were ever reported to the police. This is absolutely disgusting, and I pray that the police in Pakistan have changed significantly in the 20+ years since this horrific case. Before getting to Javid Iqbal's psychology, I want to play a very, very short clip of one of his ramblings, which I think was made to a journalist during an interview.
ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा फांसी खुदा तो मेरी हस्ती को भी नबूस कर देता अगर खुदा एक आदमी, दो आदमी, 3 आदमी, 10 आदमी, 15 आदमी, 20 आदमी खुदा का था।
Getting tired of the number of cases I've come across where religion is brought into it. It's either the devil made me do it, or God commanded me to do it. Or, in this case, well, if I was doing anything wrong, God would have stopped me. These are all examples of distancing language, shifting the responsibility of what they have done to someone or something else, allowing them to continue to diminish responsibility for their actions. It's clear that by the time that he appeared in court, Iqbal was panicking. I think he was so disconnected from reality that he believed he was justified in what he was doing, and that, when he announced his killing spree, people would fall in a pile on the floor, worship him as a god, and he would walk through the streets feared. He'd stuck his middle finger up at society, and he expected society to simply back down, having learnt their lesson, don't mess with Javid Iqbal, and then continued on his merry way, like he continuing to rape and murder children. I imagine he had fancies of newspaper interviews, television appearances, where the focus would be on him and his accomplishments, with people fascinated by his genius and the fact that he'd fought back against oppression. That is the only reason why he confessed, to get this recognition, and why he contacted the media and surrendered himself to them. However, when reality hit home and he realised, hey, people are pretty pissed, he scrambled around looking for some way to wriggle out of this airtight coffin he created for himself. And this included claiming that he'd faked everything to send some sort of powerful message to raise awareness about the plight of impoverished children. That one I find particularly pathetic. Iqbal's mindset in his offending shows profound narcissism and psychopathic personality. He genuinely appeared to think that he was above everyone else and that he should be allowed to rape as many children as he wanted. How dared the police try to stop him? If they arrested him, it was not because he had violated the bodies and minds of these children, it was because no one recognised the genius of him. These children were merely objects for him to use and abuse, to gain sexual gratification, but then to murder in order to get its own back at society that had tried to stop his sick sexual behaviour. How many children Javid Iqbal killed is unclear. It seems as though some of the children he claimed to have murdered were later found safe and well, but this only accounted for around 4 or 5 of them. Also, Around 20 to 30 of the victims have never been identified from their photos, which is heartbreaking, as these were likely children who had no one, and so, when they died, there was no one to even notice or search for them. However, around 70 of the children in the pictures were identified, and they have never returned home. So the actual total is likely to be somewhere between 70 to 90 plus, which is just a staggering and horrific total, which makes Javed Iqbal one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. As with other men who considered themselves to be superior, akin to gods, Javed Iqbal was a coward who targeted the most vulnerable in society. I'm not advocating for death to anyone, but I for one do not mourn his passing or have particular negative emotions about the manner of his death. On Monday the 22nd of July 1987, 25-year-old Wendy Nell said goodnight to her boyfriend and went to her flat in Guildford Road, Tunbridge Wells, Kent, UK. This was the last time she was seen alive. She was murdered later that evening. On Tuesday, November the 24th, 1987, 20-year-old Caroline Pearce took a taxi to her basement flat in Grosvenor Park, Tunbridge Wells, and was not seen alive again. Her body was found dumped 40 miles away a month later. This is Azra Kamal, who tragically died in a terrible accident at the age of 24 in July 2020. However, if this was not horrific enough, the man who killed Wendy and Caroline violated her body after her death, and she was not the only one. He did this to at least 100 corpses of women and children. This is the man responsible for these offences, David Fuller, aka the Morgue Monster, and his crimes will shock and appall you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. In 1987, Kent police were dealing with the double murder of two women in extremely similar circumstances. At some point during the night of Monday the 22nd of July 1987, an unidentified man broke into the flat of Wendy Nell, beat her, seriously sexually assaulted her and strangled her to death. Concerned work colleagues and her boyfriend contacted police the next day and found her window open and her body on the bed. A significant amount of blood was found at the property, showing she had bled profusely during her final moments alive. 5 months later, in December 1987, the body of a woman was found in a field in St Mary in the Marsh, approximately 40 miles from Tunbridge Wells. She had been seriously sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The body was identified as being Caroline Pearce, who had gone missing from her basement flat the month before. On the night she disappeared, screams were heard by her neighbours. These two crimes became known as the bedsit murders, but, despite extensive investigations, no suspect was identified, and the case eventually went cold. Advancing in DNA testing meant the police forces were revisiting cold cases, sometimes decades old, in order to try and identify suspects. This analysis linked the killer of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pearce, but this did not match anyone on the national database. However, by 2019, there had been the emergence of familial DNA searches, whereby the police were able to compare the DNA to known offenders who were on the database for similarities, which would suggest the unknown offender was a relative. From there, they would then focus on the family and take samples of all males to see if any of them were an exact match. The closest match was Fuller's brother, whose DNA was added to the police database in 2012, and this fact, and further inquiries, led the police to Fuller's door.
Morning. David's place. Hello. We need to come and speak to you. Oh, yes. Are you here alone? No. Okay. David, if you listen to what I'm going to say. Yes. We're from Kent Police and we're investigating the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pearce in 1987. Okay? As part of that investigation, you've been linked as a suspect, both geographically and forensically. Okay, if you listen to what my colleague's going to say to you.
Right, David, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pearce in 1987. Do you understand? You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something which will later lie in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. You are being arrested to secure and preserve evidence by means of questioning, so we can conduct searches, so forensic samples can be obtained, and to prevent your disappearance.
As an aside, I always find these murder arrest videos really fascinating, as they show an individual's last moments of freedom as they basically go straight to the police station, then to court, and then sit in prison until their trial or their sentence, and then, if convicted, serve their time, which could be 15 years, 20 years, or the rest of their lives. I wonder what Fuller was doing on his last day of freedom, what he had planned for the next day, and whether he knew that the walls had finally closed in around him. Anyway, as if the murder of 2 women was not egregious enough, police searched Fuller's property and found hard drives clearly hidden from view. What police would find on Fuller's hard drives was, in some ways, just as bad or even worse than the crimes they were arresting him for. It's important at this stage to outline a key detail about Fuller and his employment. Specifically, between 1989 and his arrest in 2020, he worked as a maintenance man in hospital, which gave him access to areas of the hospital usually out of bounds to most people, including the morgues. Fuller used this access to sexually abuse corpses and record these acts. Police found a complex filing system on Fuller's computer, where he had documented and catalogued his sickening denigration of these corpses. They found 800,000 images and 504 videos on one hard drive alone, and from this material, they were able to identify that he had sexually abused at least 102 dead bodies between 2008 and 2020, including just 2 days before his eventual arrest. The youngest corpse that Fuller violated was that of a 9-year-old girl, but he also engaged in sexual acts with the body of a 100-year-old woman. Videos were found of Fuller placing his genitals inside the mouths, anuses and vaginas of the dead bodies. He also used his tongue and fingers to penetrate them. He abused some corpses repeatedly over a number of days. Sometimes he sexually assaulted the bodies prior to their autopsies, sometimes afterwards. He abused the bodies of those who had passed away from natural causes, those who were killed in tragic accidents, and some that had taken their own lives. He also abused corpses of people from the same family. He abused bodies which were laid out ready for autopsy or for viewing by relatives, but others he removed from the fridges or took them out of body bags. He posed them and placed them in different positions to take photographs and videos. Fuller copied the mortuary records to identify the names of the corpses he violated and would catalogue these trophies, as well as searching for his victims on social media. This behaviour, as well as viewing the videos and photographs, was clearly a way for him to relive his sickening behaviour over and over again for his perverse sexual gratification. One of the bodies Fuller abused was that of 24-year-old Azra Kamal, who died tragically at night on the 16th of July 2020 when a car caught fire and she was trying to flee. However, in the darkness, she mistook a barrier as being that of the central reservation and instead did not realise that it was the outer edge of the carriageway, and she plummeted to her death. As if the distress of having your daughter taken away so cruelly and at such a young age was not bad enough, her mother, Nevres Kamal, had to be told by police that her daughter had been assaulted by Fuller on multiple occasions after her death. I'm about to play a video of part of an interview with Nevres about what happened to her daughter and how it affected her, which is distressing. However, I want to point out the bravery of this woman and her composure. If someone did this to my loved one, I'm not sure I'd be able to string a sentence together, let alone be so eloquent and strong.
I had spent 2 wonderful hours in the mortuary, sleeping with her, and that gave me some sort of comfort. Little did I know that my daughter had been violated prior to that day and in the evening of that day. So whilst I'm stroking my daughter's hair, sleeping on her hair, a man had crawled all over her skin, and there's me kissing and cuddling and saying my last goodbyes. And that's quite awful, quite awful. However, it is not Azra's shame. It is not my shame.
Maybe some would just bury their heads in the sand and not want to know any more detail. But you've actively kind of sought out the facts. You've wanted to know how long.
Yes.
When did he come in?
Yes.
What access did he have?
Yes.
You've found all of that out already.
Yes. And I tell you why, Jason, is that if you allow, for me personally, if you allow yourself to wonder what if, what happened, how could it have happened, how long, what did that person do, we spend a lot of time and energy creating confusion and pain in your mind. For me to have facts, I can focus on those facts, and I can focus my energy on that. And I will never bury my head in any sand, and nor would have Azra. I've thought long and hard about this interview, and I know that Azra would be asking me, tell the story.
So you do have the detail, and you do know. The shocking thing seems to be that he had access for 20 minutes, half an hour.
Well, I'll give you the details, Jason. The first time was 13 minutes, the second time was 15 minutes, and the day that I visited Azra and spent quality time, and my last time with Azra, was for 35 minutes.
This first video shows the moment that Fuller confessed to his evil crimes during his police interview. Notice his cowardly demeanour compared to that of Nevrez, with him hunched over, barely making eye contact, and trying to avoid actually verbalising the horrific things he had done. The second clip is looking at an obvious question in this case, and that is how Fuller was able to get away with this for so long.
Was it always in the evenings, David? Was it always evening time?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, we know that...
I want to admit that I am admitting the offences, but I don't really want to go into detail.
Yeah. Okay.
I appreciate that.
And what offences are you admitting, David?
As you've just described to me.
Okay. In terms of the sexual penetration of
Yes.
corpses? Okay. Do you know why you started?
No.
The second part to this, David, is the recording, isn't it? Of what's been happening. Okay? And we'll have to go through that in a little bit more detail, but just for now, David, alright? Just for now, alright? When that's been happening, okay? Alright? Have you been recording yourself doing those things? Recording yourself sexually penetrating the corpses?
I admit that offences.
Yeah? Okay. Did you record their names?
Yes.
Okay. Did you record their ages?
Yes.
Okay. Why did you record what was going on?
I don't know why.
What did you retain the recordings for?
I don't know either.
Okay. Was it for further sexual pleasure, David? You know, in the same way as somebody would keep pornography or things like that? Was it for further sexual pleasure?
No.
To understand this, Nevrez asked the NHS Trust for a map of the mortuary. She learned that David Fuller had swipe card access because he sometimes did maintenance work there, and that he knew staff went home at 4 p.m. Porters might still visit the receiving area delivering bodies, but the same fridges had doors opening onto the post-mortem area, where Fuller committed his crimes. Here there was no CCTV until recently, and the fridge doors were unlocked. Fuller gained access through the utility rooms, but he still passed cameras en route and needed to swipe in.
Despite the lack of CCTV cameras, I think the question still remains how someone did not notice what this man was doing. Reports state that he went into the mortuary on thousands of occasions. Surely someone must have been keeping a log of maintenance work in the building and question why, when there were no reported faults, he kept going in there. It also does not appear that his contact with the bodies was brief, so how did no one see him or catch him when he would spend significant time posing and abusing the bodies? On the 15th of December 2021 at Maidstone Crown Court, Fuller appeared for sentencing for the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, as well as 51 other offences related to the sexual abuse of corpses. He had pleaded guilty to all charges a week before. During this hearing, the extent of his depravity was fully exposed. Also contained on Fuller's hard drives were images of murdered and sexually abused women and children. there was a large number of indecent images of children, some as young as 2 years old, being forced to commit sexual acts with men. It was clear that Fuller not only had an obsession with sex, but any acts of violation related to children and women, with him appearing to be drawn to acts that caused them pain, distress and degradation. With regards to the 2 women he murdered, it was unclear but considered likely that he committed sexual acts on them after they were deceased. Fuller was then made subject to a whole life order, an extremely rare sentence in the UK, meaning that he will never be released from prison. He's currently incarcerated at HMP Frankland, a Category A prison which holds some of the worst and most dangerous offenders in the country. However, the story doesn't end there. In December 2022, Fuller was again in court for sentence. After pleading guilty to further sexual acts related to 23 corpses, he was given a further 4 years custody. However, I wish to close this part of the video by including a portion of the sentencing hearing and how the judge described Fuller's crimes.
There is a settled process by which the court reaches sentence. I must assess the degree of your responsibility, establish the harm caused, and consider aggravating and mitigating features. There is no sentencing guideline for sexual penetration of a corpse or for possessing extreme pornography. The maximum sentence for both offences is 2 years imprisonment. In my judgment, each of these offences was of high culpability, all of them the highest possible blameworthiness. The offences committed in the mortuaries involved an astonishing breach of trust and invasion of privacy, which was repeated so much that it became habitual. The dead bodies of women were used for your sexual gratification. Each was recorded, and some were further manipulated when reduced to digital images. The mortuary offences were also of the highest category of harm, as the impact statements the court has heard have testified. You have no regard for the dignity of the dead. Women who had recently died were attacked at a time when they were utterly alone and unable to resist or report your exploitation. As you well knew, those who cared for them were mourning their loss at the very time you were abusing them. There are numerous aggravating features obvious in the description of what you did: the location, the repetition, the abusive position, the utter degradation of those recently living human beings, and in particular, the multiplicity of victims. There is no mitigation. I have seen no evidence of genuine remorse, as opposed to hollow regret now that you are under public scrutiny.
It is clear that David Fuller was a committed necrophile, and it will likely take years of analysis by people much cleverer than me to understand his crimes and how his sexual beliefs developed. However, I want to have a go at it, so here are my thoughts on David Fuller and how his offending potentially progressed. Firstly, I think that it's important to point out that Fuller wasn't only interested in dead bodies, but he appeared to also have a sexual interest in acts on living women and children, with these revolving around violence and a lack of consent. I believe this demonstrates that he had an overall desire to engage in acts which degraded women and children, using their bodies any way he wanted, both before and after they died. This behaviour, I think, would have given him a great sense of power, which was likely in contrast to his general demeanour, which appears, outwardly, to be quiet and somewhat introverted. How his interest in this type of behaviour developed is not clear, but it is apparent that he'd been a ticking time bomb for most of his life. The murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce were clearly not impulsive acts and were likely planned out and were the culmination of years of fantasies. The fact that the judge believed that he may have had intercourse with their bodies after death suggests that potentially his whole aim was to kill these women in order to abuse their bodies after they had died. However, to the best of our knowledge, Fuller did not kill again, which is unusual, but I believe explainable and shows his level of cunning. Potentially Fuller found the act of murder too risky and laborious, including cleaning up the crime scene, etc., and weighed up his options as to how he could indulge his sick sexual desires without risking being caught. So, he researched jobs which would bring him into contact with dead bodies on a regular basis. I have little doubt that the reason why Fuller got the job in the hospital in 1989, a year after the murders, was to gain access to corpses to abuse. I also don't believe for a minute that Fuller's behaviour only starts in 2008 and stops in 2020, and think it is likely that he had been doing this for decades. Based on this, the number of corpses he violated could be in the thousands. Whether he did in fact commit more murders is unclear at the current time, but I would not be surprised if the name of David Fuller is not in the news again in the future. Robert Maudsley is one of the longest serving prisoners in the UK and considered one of the most dangerous. For the last 44 years, Maudsley has been in solitary confinement, 39 of these in a purpose-built glass cage underneath H&P Wakefield, one of the most high security prisons in the country, where he's not allowed contact with any other prisoners, and during the 1 hour he is allowed out each day, he's escorted by at least 4 to 6 prison officers. The reason for this is that Maudsley is a serial killer who has killed 4 people, 3 of them in prison. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Robert Maudsley was born on the 26th of June 1953 in Liverpool, UK. He was one of 12 children, with their father being a lorry driver, also called Robert, and his wife Jean. It appears that Maudsley's home life was hellish, and when he was 21 months old, he and some of his siblings were taken into care due to parental neglect. Maudsley and his siblings spent time in an orphanage being cared for by nuns, and it appears that this was the only period of stability in his life. During this time, unlike other children, Maudsley did not receive visits from his parents, and in some respects this was probably a good thing, as it gave him some distance from the abuse he had suffered. Unfortunately, at age 8, Maudsley was returned to the family home and continued to be abused by his father. One of his siblings later stated, quote, "It was just the old fella who hit us with his fists, belt and sometimes a stick, but our ma instigated half of it." Maudsley himself said, quote, "All I remember of my childhood is the beatings. Once I was locked in a room for 6 months and my father only opened the door to come in and beat me 4 or 6 times a day." It appears that Maudsley was singled out from his siblings for the worst of the abuse, and he claimed this included being sexually abused by his father. Maudsley alone was then taken back into care, with his parents telling his siblings that he was dead, so essentially cutting him off from any support. In around 1969, at age 16, Maudsley went to London and drifted around the city. He developed a drug habit and attempted suicide on numerous occasions, ending up in various psychiatric facilities where he expressed thoughts of killing his parents. In order to fund his drug habit, Maudsley committed some offences, but also worked as a rent boy, exchanging money for his sexual services. It was when working as a rent boy in 1974 that Maudsley met his first victim, a labourer called John Farrell, in Wood Green in North London. On March 14, 1974, Farrell engaged the services of Maudsley, and after they'd had sex, Maudsley claimed that Farrell showed him pictures of children he'd abused. Maudsley then took a length of cord and strangled Farrell to death. Maudsley surrendered himself to police, admitted what he'd done, and told them that he needed psychiatric care. Maudsley was found unfit to stand trial, and at the age of 21, was instead sent to Broadmoor. Broadmoor, or to give it its full name Broadmoor Hospital, is, as the name suggests, actually run by the National Health Service, and its role, like other psychiatric units, is to treat the mentally ill. However, Broadmoor is a high security facility due to only admitting the most dangerous types of individuals who pose the gravest threat to themselves or others. Due to this, Broadmoor's 284 beds are mainly occupied by people who have come from prison, the courts or police stations, having either been convicted or awaiting trial for or arrested for extremely serious offences. On very rare occasions, Broadmoor admits people have not committed any crimes yet, but are considered a danger of committing serious offences imminently. As it is a hospital, residents are known as patients, and the average stay at Broadmoor is 5 years, although some residents can spend the rest of their lives there. Once deemed well enough, the patient can then be transferred out, whether this be back to prison or to stand trial, etc. Although it's a hospital, Broadmoor's level of security is in line with a maximum security prison, including anti-escape measures, including rows of fencing, security cameras at the 20-foot surrounding wall. Anyway, also resident in Broadmoor with Maudsley was David Cheeseman, a man with a history of violence, including attempting to murder a worker at another high-security psychiatric facility by hitting them over the head with a metal bar. Another patient was David Alan Francis, a convicted child molester. On the 26th of February 1977, when Maudsley was 23 years old, he and Francis played football whilst Cheeseman watched. After the game, Cheeseman asked a male nurse to open a door where they could change out of their football boots, and the three of them went inside. When the nurse went to follow them inside, Maudsley pushed the door closed, and Cheeseman barricaded the door with a footlocker. The pair then tied up Francis and proceeded to assault and torture him over the next 9 hours, before finally strangling him to death. Maudsley had armed himself with a sharpened spoon, and he rammed this into Francis's ears so hard it went into his brain. When they'd finally killed him, Francis's body was held up and displayed to hospital staff who were able to peek in but not enter. Eventually, Maudsley and Cheeseman let them in to a sight of absolute horror. Francis's head had been, quote, split open, exposing his brain, which had the sharpened spoon stuck in it. Whilst this mode was horrific enough, there was a rumour that the spoon found in Francis's head was due to Maudsley trying to eat his brain, which then, through Chinese whispers, turned to the fact they had in fact done this and consumed other parts of Francis's body. However, this has been proven incorrect, but didn't stop Maudsley being dubbed the, quote, British Hannibal Lecter, after the famous antagonist of the Silence of the Lambs book and film. Curiously, whilst found unfit to stand trial after the first murder, Maudsley was considered competent to stand trial for the murder of Francis and was convicted before being sent to Wakefield Maximum Security Prison in West Yorkshire, dubbed the Monster Mansion, due to the number of high-risk sexual and violent offenders who were held there. On the afternoon of July the 29th, 1978, Maudsley, now 25 years old, killed 2 prisoners in the space of an hour in Wakefield Prison. Maudsley later stated he intended to kill 7 people that day. The first victim was a man named Sawney Darwood, who was serving a life sentence for murdering his wife. Maudsley apparently knew Darwood for some time, as Darwood was teaching him French. Maudsley advised him into his cell, and then attacked him, stabbing and hacking at him with a makeshift dagger and strangling him. Maudsley then hid the body under the bed in his cell. Maudsley then tried to lure other prisoners into the cell, but none of them would enter, so he went out looking for another victim. He's described as, quote, lurking on the prison wing when he came across William Roberts, a man serving a sentence for sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl who was lying on the bed in his cell. Maudsley attacked Robert, hacking him with the same dagger and smashing his head against the wall until he was dead. Maudsley then calmly walked up to a prison officer, dropped the bloody weapon on the table, and told them they would be too short at the next roll call. During his hearing for this double murder in 1979, the court heard that during his crimes Maudsley believed his victims were his parents. The killings, his lawyers argued, were the result of pent-up aggression resulting from a childhood of near-constant abuse, with them stating that Maudsley had said, quote, when I kill, I think I have my parents in mind. Maudsley also apparently said, quote, if I had killed my parents in 1970, none of these people need have died. Maudsley was returned to Wakefield Prison and kept in solitary confinement and, as his picture shows, his movements outside of his cell were shadowed by prison officers. He gave one interview where the only pictures of him are taken from, and again, as you can see from this picture, he's surrounded by prison staff. In 1983, Maudsley was deemed to be too high a risk to other prisoners. It was decided he needs to be permanently housed away from them. So a separate prison cell was built in the basement of Wakefield Prison, essentially a prison within a prison. There are no pictures of this cell, but it's described as being 18 foot by 15 foot, or 5.5 meters by 4.6 meters, with the walls being made of bulletproof glass so it can be observed from all angles. Within the cell itself is a table and chair, both made out of compressed cardboard, with the bed being a slab of concrete, and a toilet and sink which are bolted to the floor. In order to actually get to the area where he's housed, requires going through multiple security doors. Once at the cell, there's essentially an airlock which has to be gone through in order to stand face to face with Maudsley, being separated by more bulletproof glass, with there being a slot through which his meals and other items are passed to him. Maudsley is watched by officers 24 hours a day. He is allowed out of his cell once a day, but is escorted to an exercise yard by between 4 to 6 prison officers. This cell is described as closely resembling that of Hannibal Lecter in the film The Silence of the Lambs, but Maudsley's current accommodation was built 8 years before this film was released. The combination of the layouts of Maudsley's cell and previous erroneous reports about him eating part of his victims has continued to fuel the perception of him as being the British Hannibal Lecter. However, Thomas Harris, the author of the books, has never stated the character or his prison cell was inspired in any way by Maudsley. Robert Maudsley is now 69 years old, has spent the last 44 years in solitary confinement, 39 of these in his specially constructed cell, where he will remain until the end of his life. I want to preface this part of the video by saying that overall I don't support solitary confinement. It's obviously an extreme measure which causes significant emotional and psychological harm and is sometimes used as a way to simply torment others. An example is the recent unrest in Myanmar, with politicians held in these conditions after the military coup in 2021. However, I'm struggling not to think that in some cases there's little other choice when it comes to extremely dangerous offenders. Maudsley's prolonged solitary confinement has been in the news on and off over the years, including in the year 2000, when Maudsley petitioned the courts for a relaxation of his conditions or, if this was refused, access to lethal drugs to end his life. At the same time, Maudsley was in correspondence with a journalist from the Times newspaper and wrote the following letter, quote, "How did I find myself in permanent solitary confinement at Wakefield? I first killed a man outside and found myself in Broadmoor. I then killed a fellow patient at Broadmoor and eventually found my way to Wakefield, where I killed 2 fellow inmates. It's on my record that I served numerous periods of solitary confinement at Broadmoor prior to killing a fellow patient. It's also on my record that I underwent a long period of solitary confinement in various prisons prior to my arrival at Wakefield and placement on normal location. At no time in Broadmoor or those prisons did I receive any kind of psychological or psychiatric assistance or help." Numerous national newspapers and tabloids have labelled me Britain's own Hannibal Lecter, etc. All very sensational, no doubt, and I've received numerous letters from people over the years who have watched this film Silence of the Lambs and who believe it's a genuine portrayal of my life story. They are of course entitled to their beliefs, however a more accurate portrayal will be a film called Murder in the First. I mention this because an important question for these people to ask would be, to what extent my conditions and environment and treatment at Broadmoor and HP Wakefield played in causing me to react in such a savage manner. As you know, I don't see any psychologists nor any psychiatrists currently. It seems Wakefield is happy to place me in permanent solitary confinement after killing 2 of its prisoners. Actually, all Wakefield has sought to do since 1978 is to demonise me. He also wrote, quote, "Do we all not form our opinions, beliefs, etc. from how we perceive that environment? Wakefield prison authorities perceive me as a problem. Their solution to that problem to date has been in effect to bury me alive. The cage ultimately for them being my concrete coffin, but is that the final solution? What purpose is being served by keeping me locked up 23 hours a day? Why even bother to feed me and to give me 1 hour's exercise a day, month and year, yet not allow me to talk to any other inmates via their windows? Who am I actually a risk to?" Let me try to briefly answer that by saying I killed rapists, paedophiles and sex offenders. No other type of person nor other type of offender. So my past crime strongly suggests this is the group most and solely at risk. Why is this? I can say that yes, I've been raped, and yes, I've been sexually abused by such people, and consequently, I do detest these people enough to have killed them in the past. I have no previous convictions for killing prison officers, and I have no previous convictions for seriously wounding nor stabbing any prison officers, and I cannot perceive nor can I imagine any situation in which this would arise. Maudsley also told the reporter that he'd asked the courts for a budgie, and that he would take care of it and, quote, "not eat it." The Times article I read from this time is very sympathetic to Maudsley and his living conditions, and the apparent inhumanity of his situation. I looked online at various message boards and comments in response to this article and other articles about Maudsley and his living situation, and there seem to be a lot of people who perceive him as a hero, with them stating that he only killed child sex offenders, so what's the problem? These also seem to be mixed with general anti-establishment messages, including this one from 2000, which I found particularly odd to say the least. This comment describes Maudsley as, quote, "a truly superior, insightful, brilliant, soul-alive philosopher." It goes further by stating, quote, "I honour Robert's choice to speak out to the media and condemn the brutalisation, the inhumanity with which he has been treated. 46-year-old Robert is one of only 26 UK prison inmates who've been sentenced to life in prison with no chance of ever being released. Now Robert is demanding to be treated as a human being, or else he says he'd rather be murdered by the state. All he wants is to be treated as any human being in the 21st century deserves, at the very least. His voice, as published in the letter excerpts, is a cry of sanity in an insane society. In a sane society, 1 million people in England would rise up as one, together, and demand this tortured child victim, who has been unjustly tormented by society for his entire life, be finally treated as a victim worthy of limitless apology, affection, understanding, support, and only benevolent, never punitive treatment." It continues, quote, "I honour your martyrdom, Robert. If there was any justice in the world, you would have a thermonuclear bomb capable of destroying all of humanity in your hands with the launch codes, and you yourself would be asked to decide whether the human race deserves to continue to exist. You're entitled to make this decision, Robert. You alone, based upon the unforgivable lifetime of unjust torment that your society initiated against you when you were a baby, has inflicted and continues to inflict upon you." Okay, that's an extreme example, but I think it illustrates my overall point that I think Maudesley's case has been romanticised to make him out to be some sort of vigilante who only targeted child sex offenders rather than a vicious, dangerous killer. Whilst Maudsley claimed that his first victim showed him images of sexual abuse and that's why he killed him, and 2 of his other 4 victims were sex offenders, one, Stanley Darwood, was in prison for murder, and Maudsley seemed to have no problem with interacting with him before that to learn French. This doesn't fit the pattern and strikes me as something personal. Also, Maudsley was described as quite prowling the wing looking for other people to kill. I think it's difficult not to conclude that he was simply looking for anyone to kill. It came across William Roberts, killing him simply because he was in his cell and available, rather than potentially anything to do with his offending. So, whilst it's clear that Maudsley has an understandable hatred of sex offenders, I think that potentially he was just wanting to kill as many people as possible for his own reasons, potentially because of the rage towards his parents and society, due to the fact that he felt victimised and abandoned. I don't believe that Maudsley did what he did to make society a better place. His actions are far more self-centred and selfish. Perhaps because of our natural revulsion of those who harm children, it's been twisted into something more poetic than it is. The question is really, would you trust Maudsley around your family? Was Maudsley failed by society? Quite possibly. However, while sympathetic to this, many people have horrific upbringings, but they don't then use this to justify taking the lives of others. Maudsley had opportunities to be within the general population in custody, but he used this to murder not 1, not 2, but 3 people. I know the tone of his letter was to try and plead his case and highlight the injustice of his situation, but I can't help but note the self-justification in his words, blaming others for his actions and appearing to link the conditions in Broadmoor and Wakefield directly to his criminality. However, it's a circular argument. He apparently blames Wakefield for him committing the offences, but feels aggrieved that they took issue with the fact that he then murdered 2 inmates, so he blames them for what happened and then blames them for the outcome. He states that Wakefield considers him a, quote, problem. Well, yes, because you killed other prisoners. Ultimately, I'm not sure what Maudsley expects. To be taken at his word that he would only kill certain types of people and therefore should be allowed out in the general population? How the prison service would even manage this is unclear. They would have to basically leave there any prisoner who came anywhere near Maudsley to check their criminal record. However, what about someone he simply thinks is a child molester? Would he then kill them? Stripping away all the other details, Robert Maudsley killed 4 people, and therefore he's clearly a man who likes killing others for whatever reason, and who, because of this, the prison service had to build a specialist cell just for him and surround him with guards whenever he leaves it. In terms of being a martyr and tortured, it's clear that his basic needs are being met. He's sheltered and fed and is allowed out of his cell. The only thing missing is company, and Maudsley has ensured that's not possible due to killing those around him. However, it should be noted he does have visits from family members. To illustrate the continued danger of this man, more recently in 2022, there was some publicity about letters Maudsley had written to his nephew, in which he seems to have come to terms with being in solitary confinement, where he apparently spends his time playing video games, but he also disclosed that, if he was ever released, he would kill again. Just after midnight on Friday, March the 13th, 2009, a 999 call was received reporting a man had collapsed at a property at 14 Arthur Street in the town of Chiltern in County Durham in the UK. When paramedics attended, they found 35-year-old Andrew Gardner, a vulnerable man due to underlying cognitive issues, dead in the living room. The paramedics were told that Andrew had been assaulted in a bar fight, had come home and collapsed, but the police were quickly called. But it was noted that Andrew was malnourished and his body was covered with new and old injuries. Andrew had been the victim of domestic abuse for years, and his last few weeks alive had been a living nightmare, during which time he'd been tortured, including being burned, starved, beaten, as well as having noughts and crosses carved into his body, using him as some sort of human game board. 3 people were responsible: 24-year-old Simon Nichols, 44-year-old Stephen Martin, and the ringleader, 28-year-old Claire Nichols, a sadistic, psychopathic manipulator who not only inflicted horrific injuries on Andrew, but did this in front of her young children, and sickeningly, even encouraged them to participate. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Andrew Gardner was born in around 1974 in the town of Gateshead in Tyne and Wear, in northeast England, to Ken and Jean Gardner. He had significant learning disabilities, which were diagnosed when he was a child. Andrew had a close relationship with his two brothers and his parents, and they were a very tight family. There's no indication that Andrew was ever subject to or experienced violence or abuse in the home. In fact, his childhood was very loving. However, in school, he was the subject of bullying, with his peers taking advantage of him due to his naivety and kind nature. But, despite his own experiences of abuse, Andrew was described as a loving, polite and quiet young man who was never violent and who would try to diffuse situations if he could. He had a kind heart, but unfortunately was always a target of those looking to exploit him. In 2005, at the age of 31, Andrew met 23-year-old Claire Nichols, a single mother with 3 children, who had a history of violence towards intimate partners and an evidence history of sadistic behaviour. Unfortunately, this meeting would end in Andrew's death just 4 years later. Claire Nichols was born in around 1982 and was raised in Portsmouth in Hampshire. Given that 2 of the perpetrators in this case have the same surname, I'll refer to her by her first name moving forward. In contrast to the happy environment that Andrew grew up in, Claire was raised in a dysfunctional home, repeatedly witnessed domestic abuse between her parents, who eventually split up. Claire left the family home when she was 15 years old, and 3 years later, in around the year 2000, she began a relationship with a man called John Peterson. Whilst Claire was only 18, Peterson was 42 years old and had previously served in the Royal Navy. Peterson would later testify on calls about Claire, calling her a, quote, she-devil, and saying, quote, she beat and battered me all the years I was with her, 4 or 5 times a week. She was horrible, a control freak who would flip all the time. She'd throw her shoes, punch me, have a go, and verbally abuse me for the least thing. If I went to the shops without her, she'd attack me. If I went to do the gardening, she'd do the same. I still have nightmares. However, this is where the story begins to get complicated, as it's important to point out that John Peterson was a convicted paedophile. Claire was fully aware of this, and not only stayed with him, but the pair had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Social services became involved, and basically told Claire that she either needed to leave Peterson or lose the children. Rather than safeguarding her own children and doing what social services stated, she fled north, moving away to Newcastle, but taking Peterson with her. The pair finally separated in 2003, and Peterson only saw Claire after this, where she broke into his property with her new partner, Stephen Martin. Again, the story gets a bit complicated when it's pointed out that Martin had been the long-term partner of Claire's mother for around 7 years before they got together. So he basically moved from mother to daughter. The relationship between Claire and Steve Martin was on and off for around 6 years, with the pair regularly having sex, even if both were in relationships. Later, at court, Martin was found to have an IQ of 59, putting him in the lowest 1% of the population in terms of intelligence. It does appear that he was physically abused by Claire, but his main role was to cater to every command. If Claire needed something, she would snap her fingers and he would come running. In 2005, during an apparent break in her relationship with Martin, Claire Nichols met Andrew Gardner. Apparently it had occurred when he was signing up for a learning disability course at the job centre. I want to break here to point out a few things. 3 things specifically. Firstly, it's clear that Claire was a violent, controlling monster in relationships, likely replicated the behaviour she herself had seen as a child. Secondly, is her complete disregard for the welfare of anyone but herself. She allowed her children to be around a sex offender, knowing full well about John Peterson's history. I don't know what previous offences Peterson committed, but in October 2021, he was jailed for 10 years for a historic sex offence where he raped a 5-year-old girl. So he was a dangerous predator who posed a risk to female children, yet Claire had children with him and allowed them, including 2 girls, to be around him. And instead of taking the advice of social services, ran off, taking her children and the paedophile with her. Clearly no one else mattered but Claire. She did not care what her children were exposed to. I was willing to place them at risk. Which brings me on to the 3rd point, the reason why she did this. I think that she stayed with Peterson because he was someone she felt she could easily control. He was a paedophile, likely vilified by everyone who knew him, and likely alone. Someone, she believed, if he reported anything, would not be believed, or potentially others would think he deserved it. She had leverage over him. If he displeased her, she could very easily disclose this offending to anyone she wanted, making his life hell. This fits within a pattern of targeting and beginning relationships with men who were vulnerable or had some other issue which she believed she could exploit. With Steve Martin, he had an extremely low IQ and was basically her lapdog. And then she met Andrew Gardner, who, as I said, she apparently met when he was signing up for a course where people learn disabilities at the job centre. I can't help but draw the conclusion that Claire approached him and saw him as someone she could control and begin a relationship with for that purpose. Unfortunately, Andrew had no idea about Claire's background and walked into the spider's web. Soon after the relationship began, Andrew and Claire moved in together, and he became a surrogate father for her 3 children. Also living in the property was Claire's younger brother Simon, who was later around 19 or 20 years old when the relationship began in 2005. Simon was again a man of low intelligence, just the sort of person that Claire felt she could dominate, and therefore was useful to her. Within the family home, Claire was a monster, fully in charge. She would exert control any way she wanted and punish any dissent swiftly and forcefully. With her brother Simon, she would beat him if he didn't do household tasks to her satisfaction. However, the main abuse was reserved for Andrew. He was frequently beaten, and this carried on when Claire became pregnant with his child in around 2007. Andrew would be punched repeatedly if he tried to get anything to eat, with him needing to ask permission to eat the food in his own home. He was often starving, as Claire would sometimes forbid him from eating any meals for days, and he had to resort to taking food when she wasn't looking. She would then accuse him of, quote, stealing. Again, this is the food in his own home, and then he would be beaten. Claire went as far as ripping the pockets out of Andrew's trousers, so he could not conceal food from her. The last time that Ken and Jean Gardner, Andrew's parents, physically saw their son was in 2006, when he turned up at their door, looking malnourished and distressed. He was no longer the happy man they remembered. He'd been beaten down, and his spirit was broken. Despite trying to contact him over the years, they had no luck, and it was all due to Claire. She forbid Andrew from contacting his parents. In around 2008, Claire gave birth to a daughter. Andrew's first child, her 4th, and he was forbidden from taking this child to see his parents. In fact, it was not until after his death that Ken or Jean even knew they were grandparents. In July 2008, Claire, her brother Simon, Andrew, and the 4 children moved into 14 Arthur Street in the town of Chiltern. It's here that Andrew would suffer a horrifying death less than a year later. Andrew was basically a prisoner in 14 Arthur Street. He was prohibited by Claire from leaving the house without permission, and it got to the point where the neighbours had no idea that Andrew was living in the property, as they rarely even saw him. Also, his parents didn't even know where he was living. Both Claire and Simon would beat Andrew, with Simon acting on the directions of his sister. Andrew was becoming increasingly emaciated, and he was starved for days, being beaten if he dared to take food from the house in order to keep himself alive. He was also forced to sit, watching the family eat a meal while he got nothing. Claire would also verbally abuse Andrew, telling him he was useless and a drain on the household. For some reason, in about February 2009, Claire told Steve Martin to move into the property, meaning there were 8 people in this small house. After this point, the level of torture endured by Andrew escalated significantly, and his final months were nothing short of a nightmare. The 3 of them took turns in torturing Andrew, with Claire coming up with various ideas about how to inflict as much pain on him as possible. Andrew had boiling hot water poured over him and was burnt on his body, especially his neck, with a cigarette lighter. He was forbidden from sleeping on a bed or sitting on a sofa. Instead, he was forced to sit and sleep on piles of newspaper, which would be used to soak up the blood from his injuries. Also, Claire would have sex with Martin right in front of Andrew in order to cause him as much distress as possible. This catalogue of abuse is shocking enough, but it gets worse. It needs to be pointed out that the 4 children in the property were witness to all of this, and in an absolute sign of complete depravity, Claire directed her children, including the daughter she had with Andrew, to participate. These children were only 5, 7, and 9 years old. In court, Claire's 7-year-old son would state, quote, "My ma'am got him and stamped on him. She does that because he's stealing food. He thieved a chocolate bar once. We hit him as well. I scratched him with keys and also hit him with my fists. We wrote swear words on his back. We do that in pen and nail varnish." All 4 children were encouraged to abuse Andrew, and this included cutting him with a knife. After his death, Andrew was found to have noughts and crosses carved into his body, which the children had done under the direction, under the direction of their mother. Andrew was also whipped with wet tea towels, and his injuries later showed that he'd been cut with knives, including receiving a cut to his leg so deep that it exposed his tendons. Andrew was beaten mercilessly by all 3 adults in the home. At the beginning of March 2009, Claire started jumping up and down on Andrew with all of her might, causing severe fractures to his ribs. She would also jump up and then land on him with her knees. This caused severe internal injuries, and Andrew spent his last few days in agony. For approximately a week prior to his death, Andrew was unable to walk and was likely slipping in and out of consciousness in excruciating pain. It's believed that he was merely propped up against the wall, and it would have been clear he was dying, but no one came to help Andrew. Also remember that all 4 children would have seen this, including Andrew's daughter. Sometime in the late evening of the 12th of March 2009, Andrew suffered one final attack, when Simon and Martin held him down, and Claire again jumped on his ribs, as well as kneeing him in this area, with enough force to cause further rib fractures. She also kicked his already burnt feet, fracturing one of them. Sometime during, or immediately after this attack, his body gave out, and Andrew Gardner died. Paramedics who attended the scene on the 13th of March 2009 did not believe a word of what was said to them. Andrew had clearly suffered injuries over weeks and had not died due to some fight. The police reached the same conclusion, and Claire Nichols, her brother Simon, and Steve Martin were all arrested on suspicion of murder. The autopsy of Andrew Gardner took 7 hours due to the sheer number of injuries that needed to be documented. Andrew's body was found to have over 150 separate injuries, including numerous fractures, with 21 of these being to his ribs from where he had been stamped on. There was also bleeding on the brain from repeated head injuries. There were also injuries from where Andrew had been slashed with knives, whipped, and burned both with hot water and cigarette lighters. He also had bruises and scars all over his body, as well as blood poisoning. Despite being 35 years old at the time of his death, and 5'9", Andrew weighed just 120 pounds, or around 9 stone at the time of his passing. This was due to him having been starved for months. Andrew's injuries were so horrific that they were determined to have been akin to someone who had suffered a traumatic fall from a height or a serious car crash. Andrew's death was determined to have been primarily due to crushing chest injuries, which caused significant trauma to his organs, including his lungs and heart, as well as internal bleeding. Andrew essentially suffocated and bled to death. His final days would have been characterized by excruciating pain. All 3 suspects were interviewed, and both Simon Nichols and Steve Martin broke quickly, trying to save their own skins by pointing the finger at Claire. Simon and Martin both admitted they had physically abused Andrew, but they said that Claire was the ringleader and they were only following her directions, and they were both afraid of defying her due to her violent temper. Claire simply denied everything, claiming that in the hours prior to the 999 call being made, Andrew had been out and apparently had been mugged. He then staggered home and collapsed. 30 minutes later, an ambulance was called according to her. However, it was clear that Andrew had been dead for hours by the time help was called. The evidence against the 3 was overwhelming, and they were all charged with the murder of Andrew and remanded into prison to await their day in court. On the 4th of January 2010, Claire Nichols, her brother Simon, and Steve Martin went on trial for murder at Teesside Crown Court, having pleaded not guilty to these charges. Simon and Martin essentially continued to dig themselves nice big holes, admitted acts of violence against Andrew, but pointed to Claire as the main instigator, and that they only did these things because they were afraid of her. They seemed to misunderstand they were essentially admitting to their role in Andrew's death and just implicating Claire rather than actually proving their innocence. During the course of the trial, it's established that, whilst they may have been afraid of Claire, they made choices to become involved. In the case of Steve Martin, he'd been living away from the property and had moved into Arthur Street of his own volition. Claire twisted and turned during the course of the trial. She was initially determined to throw her brother and Martin under the bus, then reverse back over them. She continued to try and exert control over them, including shouting out that they were liars when they were giving evidence implicating her. Realising the writing was on the wall, Claire tried to claim that she had assaulted Andrew, but that his death was accidental, and therefore she was guilty only of manslaughter. This was rejected by the court. When she took the stand, Claire was ripped apart, making statements which were obviously bullshit and made no sense. On the stand, the prosecutor stated, quote, "Miss Nichols, you caused him that excruciating pain because you jumped on him with your knee, a technique you used." She responded by saying, quote, "I admit to jumping on him once. The rest of his broken ribs would have been caused by my brother Simon. I did not realise that my knee going into his ribs was going to cause him so much pain. So she kneed him in the ribs with enough force to break them, but didn't realise this would cause him pain." Absolute bollocks. On the stand, Claire showed herself to be a psychopath, a woman without remorse. Her crocodile tears were a facade, trying to gain sympathy from the jury and avoid taking any responsibility for the torture and murder of an innocent and vulnerable man. The jury saw through her lies, and all three were convicted of murder. On the 22nd of January 2010, Claire and Simon Nichols stood to be sentenced before Judge Peter Fox. His sentencing remarks noted that the death of Andrew Gardner was an act of sadism. He stated that Claire was a controlling, manipulative, callous and calculating woman who has a, quote, "deeply entrenched personality disorder." He said that she had set a, quote, "dreadful example for her children by exposing them to such serious acts of violence and encouraging them to assist in torturing Andrew. With regards to Simon, Judge Fox said that he had acted, quote, "knowing full well what your sister was doing to this man. You repeatedly were the enforcer, stepping in cruelly when he sought to resist or avoid her attacks." Judge Fox reinforced the findings of the pathologist that Andrew Gardner died in agony due to the extensive injuries he had suffered from weeks of torture. He concluded by stating, quote, "In the weeks prior to his demise on Friday, March the 13th last year, he was cruelly tortured and subjected to an appalling catalogue of attacks, which not only caused him acute pain in so many ways at your hands, but also dreadful humiliation. In your sometimes different, but sometimes joint ways, you each contributed not only to the breaking of his body, but also his spirit. In his final days, that you must have spent prone or leaning against a wall, he was deprived of all human dignity." He then sentenced them. For the murder of Andrew Gardner, Claire Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 32 years before she can apply for parole. Simon Nichols was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Stephen Martin's sentence was delayed for various reports to be written, and on the 13th of February 2010, he too was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 20 years before he could apply for parole. All three subsequently appealed the length of their sentences, but all were rejected. This case just has layers of horror, and this is again highlighted by how Ken and Jean Gardner found out about their son's death. They saw news about a man being found dead at a property in Chiltern, but had no idea that this was their son. As they did not know where he was living at the time, Claire made sure he was totally cut off from them, but then had to go through the horror of receiving a knock at the door and being told their son was not only dead, but had been the victim of domestic abuse for years, and his last few weeks on Earth had been marked by horrific acts of torture. A victim impact statement read out in court written by Jean stated, quote, "To be told that Andrew was dead was horrible. I knew there was something wrong straight away. He was someone who would simply walk away from trouble. To listen to the details of how he died and the suffering he went through was beyond belief. The thoughts of what went on at the hands and direction of that evil woman has left me with nightmares that will probably never go away. Andrew was a pleasant, caring, loving lad who kept out of trouble I was never violent to anyone. It's hurt being here. It's hurt watching her give evidence, so much so I had to go out of the courtroom. I knew she was lying. It's unspeakable what she and the others did. You don't do that to another human being. They turned our family's lives upside down and left us empty shells. I called them evil to their faces in court, but it hurt even more to see their smug reaction. No matter how long they're behind bars, the hurt they cause will never go away. It will be with me and my family forever. To highlight the man that Andrew was, in contrast to the monsters who robbed him of his life, it's assumed the reason why Andrew stayed in the property was for one reason, and for one reason only: the daughter he had with Claire. He was described as a, quote, doting father to his daughter. He loved her and wanted to be with her, and was not a man to abandon his responsibilities. His family believe, and I think this is true, that Andrew was unwilling to abandon his daughter, to leave her in the care of a woman as evil as Claire, and so he stayed, with him hoping, probably, that he could protect her from her sadistic mother. Unfortunately, this would cost him his life. It upsets me when people make comments saying, why did they not just leave, or why did they not see the red flags? I realise now I shouldn't be annoyed or upset. People don't necessarily understand domestic abuse and how insidious it is. Leaving is not that easy. Do you not think that someone whose whole purpose is to control their partner has not worked to cut every avenue of escape? When people say, why did she not leave him, or why did he not leave her, this suggests this person is the one making choices in a relationship, and this is missing the whole point. They've often been robbed of this choice, often because they're scared of what might happen to them, which is a well-founded concern, as in the UK, 2 women a week are murdered by their partners or former partners. So please, think what you write. Domestic abuse is much more complicated than you probably realise. I think this is important to point out because of Andrew. He was clearly isolated, alone with no money, and basically confined to the house. He had no means of escape. And this should be the focus. The fact that this poor man spent his final weeks being abused and tortured, and that he died alone, with this being the only escape from the horror he endured. I hope he's at peace. While 3 people were convicted of Andrew's murder, it's clear that Claire Nichols was the ringleader, so my focus will be on her. This woman is truly evil, a psychopathic sadist who clearly has no remorse or empathy or interest in anyone but herself. It's clear she's a woman who saw people in her life as a means to an end, things to be manipulated, used and abused. I don't have enough information about Claire's past to identify when or how she became this type of monster. But, like other people I've covered, like Catherine Knight, I think she despised men, saw them as beneath her, and therefore she was able to justify treating them in any way she wanted. She was also an utter coward, targeting the most vulnerable men she could find to do her bidding and to control, knowing that these individuals likely had significant difficulties in understanding the danger they were in and potentially did not have the ability to reach out for help or formulate a plan to escape. I have a particular disdain of people who target the vulnerable, for reasons that I'll probably get into at some point in the future. But basically, adults who I've met with learning disabilities have often been some of the purest, least pretentious people I've ever met. They're some of the most caring and kindest people. They see the world in such a different way, a way I would like to see it. It's a place of happiness and hope. So when these people are targeted, I feel truly sickened, as they often have no defense against the predators of this world, and their pure spirit and their personality, which more people should have, is destroyed. Andrew Garden was someone like this. Everything I've read about him says that he was a lovely man, someone who's honest, caring, trustworthy, and devoted to those he loved. He loved his daughter, and stayed and suffered the abuse, likely so that he could be near her, and try to protect her. He wanted to bring happiness into the world, and he was targeted, abused, and murdered by a woman so weak that she needed to manipulate and control vulnerable men in her life in order to feel a sense of control. The part of this case which really, really gets to me, and which I think shows the utter depravity of Claire Nichols, is the issue of her children. As I already said earlier, she allowed them to be around a convicted paedophile, showing no regard for the potential harm this person could have caused them. But, worse still, she exposed them to horrific acts of violence towards Andrew, and even got them to be involved in his behaviour. None of these children were over the age of 10 years old, but her poisonous parenting meant that she'd made them believe that torturing someone was okay. However, I don't think she thought about this too much. She didn't give a shit about the lifelong trauma these children would have to deal with. Her only focus was on getting others to do her bidding. Also, Claire would have known as part of the trial prep that her 7-year-old son was going to be forced to testify, not only having to relive the horror that he'd seen in his home, but also having to admit that he had been involved in the abuse of Andrew. This would have no doubt re-traumatised his child, but Claire did not care. She was willing to throw anyone under the bus to save her own skin. As I've said repeatedly in my videos, the one constant is the link between childhood experiences and future criminal behaviour. In the case of Claire, all she taught her children was that violence and manipulation was acceptable, that people who you claim to love are allowed to be hurt, tortured, or even killed. I know it will never happen, but I really believe there should be some accountability for parents if their children go on to do horrific things and there is a link to what they're exposed to in the family home. Basically, if one of Claire's children becomes a domestic abuse perpetrator, etc., then I think she should be held accountable as well. I have no information about where her children ended up, but I pray they were taken away from the family altogether and placed with loving people who could try and undo some of the damage their demon of a mother caused. Not that Claire would ever admit any fault. She's a pathetic creature who, in my opinion, and this may be a little strong, should never have been a mother, and who should spend the rest of her life behind bars for the horrific torture and murder of Andrew. I'm not sure someone who does something like this, and whose personality is so clearly sadistic and psychopathic, can ever truly be considered to not be a risk to society. However, the question of whether she will be released or not is not something that will be addressed until approximately 2042, when she's able to apply for parole, when she's around the age of 60 years old. At 12:49 AM on the 15th of January 2018, the following call was made to 999.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
No.
They're not breathing?
No.
Okay. And who was it we're talking about?
Lexi, she's 3.
She's 3? Bear with me. Okay. So, she's unconscious and she's not breathing. So help has been arranged, okay?
The woman making this call, 21-year-old Louise Porton, had just murdered her 3-year-old daughter Lexi after 2 previous failed attempts, which left her fighting for her life. Porton smothered Lexi and waited hours to make sure she was dead before calling for an ambulance. Just 18 days later, Porton made another phone call for help as her 17-month-old daughter Scarlett had stopped breathing. Paramedics found that this child too had been dead for some time before help was called, with Porton having smothered her hours before. Porton is an evil, self-obsessed woman, utterly without conscience and remorse, who, whilst Lexi was fighting for her life during an unsuccessful attempt to kill her, was in the hospital toilet, sending topless photos of herself to men, and, when this child died, she was heard laughing at the funeral home. She also begged men for money to drive Scarlett to the hospital, knowing she was already dead. Her crimes, callousness, and likely motivation for murdering her own children is truly sickening, and I have no doubt will appall you. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Louise Porton was born in 1996 and raised in the market town of Walsall, in the county of Warwickshire, in the West Midlands of the UK. Despite apparently coming from a close family, Porton soon developed into a selfish, vindictive, violent and narcissistic child. Those close to Porton later testified in court that the family was close-knit, but she was always an outsider, and this was through choice. When the family would visit Porton's grandmother, Joy, she would sit with a scowl on her face in the corner, alone, whilst everyone else enjoyed their time together. If anyone sat near her, she would say, quote, "Go away or I'll smash your face." Porton would also be very vindictive. She would dig her nails into her cousin's skin when no one was looking, causing them to cry, and then she would deny all knowledge of this happening. She was reported to have never apologised for anything she did. When she was around 11 years old, Joy began noticing that every time that Porton would come round, items of money would go missing. It was clear that Porton was stealing from her grandmother. When challenged on this, Porton would use emotional manipulation to get her own way, telling her grandmother if she accused her of stealing, then she'd never come round again. So Joy would continue to let her come round, not wanting to lose connection with their family, and things would continue to go missing. From an early age, it was clear that Porter was obsessed with money and owning things. She was incredibly materialistic. Her abusive behaviour towards her family meant she was basically cut off from them, something she seemed to be indifferent about. The final straw came in 2016 when Porter was aged around 20, and when Joy became seriously ill and had to be admitted to hospital, it became clear quickly that she was not going to recover. One of her cousins later recalled, quote, "When Nan was in hospital, she was the only one who wouldn't come. I contacted Louise and told her they'd given Nan less than 24 hours, but she said, I can't make it. I told her it was the last chance. She said, I heard what you said, but I'm not coming. I just put the phone down. I was so emotional." After this point, the family cut her off. Porton herself appears to have been abandoned by her mother, Sharon Porton, which was around 11 years old, with her leaving the family home to begin another relationship, leaving their father to raise her and her 2 siblings. This understandably devastated Porton, as she didn't speak to her mother for a number of years, and this separation likely led to a deterioration of her own, already concerning behaviour, which was entirely self-centred, with her quickly defining herself by money she stole and items she bought with her ill-gotten gains. Porton did reconnect with her mother Sharon when she reached adulthood, but the damage was likely already done by this point. While still a teenager, Porton became extremely promiscuous. She's reported to have had sex with anyone who would show her attention. Porton quickly realised that she could use this behaviour to make money for herself, and so would specifically seek out men with means, who, in exchange for sex, would give her cash or buy designer clothes or shoes or handbags, etc. By the age of 18 years old, she was signed up with various dating sites offering sexual services for money, and she would regularly go on Facebook to brag about how much money she was making from sex work, showing defiance of anyone who would call her out for her behaviour, claiming they were just jealous of how easily she could make money. Porton had, it would appear, some relationships that didn't revolve around payment. This included one with a man called Chris Draper. However, Porton was abusive within the relationship, deliberately bragging to Chris about the men she was sleeping with and the amount of money she was making. She seemed to get off on making others feel small. This union, such as it was, produced 2 beautiful children, both girls, Lexi Draper, who was born in 2014, and Scarlett Vaughan, who entered the world in 2016. Chris was estranged from his daughters at the time of their deaths in 2018. This was apparently due to Porton, as, in an act of complete malice, when she was pregnant with Scarlett, she moved to Rugby, a town 40 miles away, and forbid Chris from seeing Lexi. He was not there at the birth of Scarlett, and was forbidden from seeing her. He could only see pictures of her online. Tragically, he never met her before she died. Porter would emotionally abuse Chris online, claiming that neither child was his. However, Porton didn't care about the children. They were merely props, a thing to use to get what she wanted. She took them away from Chris to hurt him. This was all about what she wanted. This is shown in her caring for the children, and I use that term loosely. Porton would spend hours on internet dating sites, including Meet Me and Badoo, offering her services for as little as £30 while she was meant to be looking after the children. And messages recovered after her arrest show that she was bringing men back to the property where she lived. Her and her children shared a bedroom, but this didn't stop her, as she messaged one client saying they could still have sex in the room as long as they were quiet so as not to wake the children. On another occasion, Porton went outside to have sex with a man in a van while the children were sleeping. She was also on various websites referring to herself as a, quote, model, including appearing under the name Lollipop on the website Purple Port. In court, her landlady, Leanne Bradley, said it was, quote, rare for Porton to look after the children, and she would often be asked to look after them when she was out to meet men. It got to the point where they were spending more time being looked after by Leanne than by their mother. When she was around, Porton was abusive to the children, and Leanne recalled in court, quote, they would cry and not always do what she asked them to do. She would tell them to shut the fuck up, or she would give them something to cry for. Porter would also sometimes leave the children with her mother, Sharon Porton, seeing that she would only reach out to family when she wanted something. At their post-mortem, the children were found to have injuries to their bodies, suggesting that Porton had beaten them before their deaths. Porton would moan to everyone that she was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet and living in poverty. However, she was obsessed with posting pictures of her lifestyle, including shocking trips and various outfits she was buying. Clearly, every penny that she got was used on herself. She had long-term arrangements with some of the men she had sex with, and when she would snap her fingers, they would send money to her account to fund her shopping trips or pay for her petrol, etc. One of the measures recovered after her arrest showed her asking for money for pictures, with her saying, quote, "Tell me how much you put in and I will do pictures. If you put in enough, we can meet up and I will fuck you." Before discussing the horrific sequence of events that came next, I want to point out a few things. First and foremost is the extreme narcissism of Louise Porton. I've rarely seen a case with someone so fixated on themselves with no consideration for anyone else. Even people I've met who have been deeply self-centered have a small glimmer of consideration for other people. If a family member was dying, even they would know that they should be there in person. However, if something didn't benefit Porton, then she wasn't interested. Her grandmother, a woman who had apparently been a consistent part of her life, was dying. But who cares? Can't be bothered. All Porton was interested in was money. Secondly is her utter vindictiveness, bordering, in my opinion, on sadism. She was, from a young age, someone who enjoyed causing harm to others, seeing them in distress. Later, she deliberately stopped a man from seeing his own children, purely, I think, to cause him pain. She even claimed that he wasn't the father, an act of pure spite. Likely, this also explains the reason she didn't see her grandmother before she died. She wanted her to be upset that family member didn't come to see her. Porton wanted her to suffer. Lastly, is Porton's complete lack of remorse at any stage of her life. She didn't feel bad about harming her cousins as a child, or stealing from her grandmother. She didn't feel anything when she died, and thought nothing of ripping a man away from his children, or depriving them of a father. It was widely reported later that Porton killed her children as they got in the way of her sex life. This seems to have stuck, as is the angle the prosecution played. But, as I come back to later, this was not accepted by the judge. It's not actually what the evidence shows. The reason why Porton did what she did, in my opinion, was far, far more complex and much more sinister. And I'll highlight this as we go along, and I'm confident that, by the end, you'll agree this woman is pure evil. By January 2018, Louise Porton had decided to kill her children. She began with 3-year-old Lexi. Before finally ending her life, Porton tried to kill her on at least 2 occasions. On the 2nd of January 2018, a call was made to 999 by Porton, saying that Lexi was experiencing breathing difficulties. Paramedics rushed to the property and found Lexi unconscious. She was soon revived and taken to hospital, arriving there at around 1 a.m. Text messages show that during the ride to the hospital, and whilst her daughter was being treated, Porton was sending messages to someone about a, quote, happy ending, and at 1:18 a.m, she was arranging a meeting with a man and telling him he needs to pay cash up front. At around 6 a.m, Lexi was discharged from hospital. In the early hours of the 4th of January 2018, another call was made to 999 by Porton, who said that Lexi was again struggling to breathe. Paramedics rushed to the property again and found Lexi unconscious, lying on her back on the floor. A paramedic who attended said in court that her condition was critical, that Lexi was suffering from severe breathing difficulties. She was stabilised at the scene and rushed to the hospital. Without this intervention, Lexi would have died. The paramedic said that Porton was, quote, not distressed at all in the back of the ambulance, and he stated he believed that she was drinking wine from a glass when he first attended. Whilst Lexi was fighting for her life in hospital, Porton was in the toilet, taking selfies of her breasts to send to people she was arranging to meet for sex. She acted the concerned mother to various men she messaged, and to at least one, she said, quote, really need funds to help me get by. And this, here, is in my opinion the primary motivation for why Porton did what she did. Money. As it will be shown moving forward, anytime she could use a tragedy to turn a profit, she would. Tragically, it wouldn't be determined until after her death that Lexi had been strangled by Porton, resulting in her almost dying on 2 occasions. It seems that Lexi was only in hospital until late on the 4th of January or the 5th of January 2018, and during this time, Porton was making various searches, including, quote, "Can you actually die if you have a blocked nose and cover your mouth with tape? And how long after drowning could someone be resuscitated?" She was also reading articles about children who'd been brought back to life after drowning. On the 6th of January 2018, rather than looking after her daughter, who had just come out of hospital, Porton was offering her sexual services to a man for the entire day for £300. Louise Porton decided to finally kill Lexi on the 14th of January 2018, and, the day before, made further harrowing online searches, including, quote, "How long does it take for a dead body to go cold up to the shoulder?" She also sent a message to a man saying that a doctor had said that Lexi had flu and would soon pass away. This was clearly a lie. This harrowing CCTV footage shows Lexi entering the family home for the last time, being followed by her sister. Just a few hours later, Porton would suffocate Lexi by placing either a hand or some other object over her nose and mouth. Porton then waited hours to make sure Lexi was dead and there was no chance of her being revived. Only then did she make the 999 call I played at the beginning of the video, which was made at 12:49 AM on the 15th of January 2018. Paramedics again returned to the same address they'd been to twice before in the last 2 weeks, but this time there was no saving Lexi. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Paramedics were concerned, as Lexi had clearly been dead for hours, and they were not convinced by Porton's claims that she'd found her daughter lifeless in bed and called an ambulance straight away. Again, Porton showed no emotion and didn't shed a tear at the death of her daughter. The next day, Porton was back online arranging sex with men. On screen are conversations recovered from this day, the 16th of January 2018, and as you can see, she describes herself as a model, but says she's taking a break because, quote, "My little girl passed away yesterday." However, within an hour and a half, Porton is talking to another man called Leon, arranging a, quote, "date." Porton couldn't even pretend to care, and a few days later was seen laughing at her funeral directors and yawning when discussing the arrangements for Lexi. She also sent a message to a friend, making a joke that she'd gone from 2 children to just 1. On January the 19th, 2018, post-mortem examination was conducted on Lexi, but her cause of death couldn't be determined. It was concluded that her death wasn't natural and was unexplained, but at the time, not suspicious. Various samples were sent away for analysis. Unfortunately, the results of these tests would not be returned in time, as, just 18 days later, Louise Porton killed for the second time. This time, she ended the life of her 17-month-old daughter, Scarlett. On the 1st of February 2018, Louise Porton and Scarlett were staying in a hotel, I believe due to some issue with their own property. CCTV footage from 6:55 PM shows Porton carrying Scarlett up to the hotel room, where, likely within minutes, she was suffocated by her own mother, in the same way Lexi had been murdered. There's no doubt that, by around 7:30 PM, Scarlett was dead. Porton again sat with her daughter's body to make sure she was dead. She didn't call for help. Her utter callousness was shown by messages sent during this time. As shown on screen, note that she describes Scarlett as being, quote, "not well," and at 9:22 PM, she begins messaging a guy saying, quote, "Any chance of putting 30 in my bank now for fuels to get my daughter Scarlett to the hospital? I'll transfer it back Wednesday." So, with her daughter already dead, Porton is trying to get money. I have no words for this woman, I really don't. Finally, confident that her daughter was dead, at around 10 PM, Porton strapped Scarlett in a car seat and was seen driving. 15 minutes later, she stops at a petrol station to fill up her vehicle, apparently without a care in the world. At this point, she's standing mere feet away from her dead daughter, who is strapped into the car seat. You would think that Porton was driving to the hospital. No, soon after filling up her car, she pulled over and dialed 111, the non-emergency medical advice line in the UK, and said that Scarlett had become unwell when they were driving, and then she stopped breathing. Porton then returned to the hotel, unstrapped her daughter from the car seat, and returned her to the room where she'd been murdered. Paramedics arrived at around 11 p.m. It was clear there was nothing that could be done for Scarlett. She was freezing cold, and her body was stiff, indicating that she'd been dead for hours. So, by the age of just 21, and within the space of 18 days, Louise Porton had murdered her 2 children. The deaths of 2 children, with no significant medical history, just 18 days apart, obviously raised alarm bells. And, on the 2nd of February 2018, a post-mortem was conducted on Scarlett, and a further one completed on Lexi. Various tests were completed, and samples taken, and Warwickshire Police were notified, and a murder investigation was started. Unfortunately, a case like this takes time to compile, and Porton will remain at liberty for almost a year before justice finally caught up with her. In the immediate aftermath, Porton showed absolutely no emotion in the days after losing her 2nd child. She was described as going to an appointment with a housing officer on the 5th of February 2018 and being completely calm and emotionless. On March the 20th, 2018, Louise Porton was arrested on suspicion of murdering Lexi and Scarlett and released under investigation. It's clear the police didn't have enough evidence to charge her, but I always think this is a shot across the bow, letting the perp know it's only a matter of time, hoping they'll crumble or make a mistake. However, Porton was unfazed, and sickeningly, in June 2018, she posted an ad on Facebook selling her dead children's clothes. I mean, look at this image. The clothes of her dead children have basically been stuffed into a bin bag and are also strewn all over the floor. I've no doubt this is a reflection of how she saw her own children and how she treated them. Porton carried on doing what she would do for years, arranging sex with men online, claiming to be a model, but also using the death of her own children to make a profit, including selling their clothes. On the 24th of November 2018, she uploaded this disgusting post as a tribute to the children she'd murdered, which reads, quote, "Mummy's angels, take from me too soon, you'll never be forgotten. R.I.P. However, whilst the police were slowly working behind the scenes to build a case, Porton had already been convicted in the court of public opinion. She was subjected to constant trolling, and her response was to post things like, quote, "Fuck the haters." Initially in Porton's corner was her mother Sharon, who I think just didn't want to believe her daughter was capable of these things. But in March 2018, Sharon posted a message on Facebook saying that her daughter had punched her to the floor. Finally, in January 2019, enough evidence had been gathered to prove not only that Lexi and Scarlett had been suffocated to death by Porton, but she'd also tried to kill Lexi on 2 previous occasions. In addition, all of Porton's social media posts and messages had been catalogued. And, on January the 25th, 2019, Louise Porton was rearrested and charged with the murders of 3-year-old Lexi Draper and 17-month-old Scarlett Vaughan, and she was remanded into custody to await her day in court. To no one's surprise, Louise Porton pleaded not guilty to all charges, and her trial started on the 3rd of July 2019 at Birmingham Crown Court. As I said at the beginning of the video, the prosecution framed this as Porton killing her children because they got in the way of her sex life. But, over the 28-day trial, this wasn't the picture that was outlined. Although this claim stuck, it was shown that Porton carried on her sex life, regardless of whether the children were there or not. There was no real change in her activity before the children were born or after they died. Porton gave evidence, but simply denied any wrongdoing, stating that she loved her children and had no reason to kill them, but her cold demeanour didn't help her case. On the 31st of July 2019, the jury went out to deliberate and returned within 24 hours to deliver unanimous guilty verdicts to the charges of murdering Lexi and Scarlett. The next day, the 2nd of August 2019, Porton stood before Mrs. Justice Yip for sentencing. She described Porton's actions as both, quote, evil and calculated. She stated, quote, "These were blameless, young children who were plainly vulnerable and ought to have been able to rely on their mother to protect and nurture them. Instead, you took their young lives away." She said there were no obvious signs of Porton suffering from any mental illness, but that, quote, "It's plainly part of your makeup that you find it difficult to make and sustain emotional attachments and to put the needs of others ahead of your own." She then sentenced her. For the murders of Lexi Draper and Scarlett Vaughan, Louise Porton was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 32 years before she can apply for parole. Porton showed no emotion during her sentencing. Aside from her current prison being publicised, H&P Foston Hall, a women's closed prison in the village of Foston in Derbyshire, little has been reported about Porton's time inside. I imagine she won't have an easy time of it. I'll have to grow up quickly in this environment. Lexi and Scarlett were finally laid to rest, together, on the 3rd of September 2019, with their tiny coffins being carried in a carriage drawn by 4 white horses, taking them on their final journey. Their funeral was organised by their father, Chris Draper, who said that he wanted to give them, quote, "the send-off you deserved." I cannot imagine the pain this man endured, bearing both his children, including one he'd never met. In a victim impact statement in court, Chris spoke about things suicidal after the death of his children. He said, quote, "I am broken. I keep asking myself, why did Louise do something so evil to our beautiful daughters?" He continued, quote, "No punishment will ever be enough, as I'll never get my daughters back." After the funeral, he wrote on Facebook, quote, "Gave you the send-off you deserved. All eyes on you, and you'll be missed, but never forgotten. Sleep tight, babies. Daddy's got you. Daddy will always have your back. Sleep tight. Love, your daddy." I hope with all sincerity that Lexi and Scarlett are safe, loved, and together for the rest of eternity. Rest in peace, little angels. The death of the children also devastated their grandmother, Sharon Porter, and, in a terrible postscript, she committed suicide on the 2nd of September 2020. Friends said she struggled to cope with the grief of losing her grandchildren and the guilt that she raised a monster and had not stopped her. It also appears that she was receiving a lot of abuse for the actions of her daughter. So, Louise Porton's behaviour, her evil, claimed the lives of, in my opinion, 3 people, and irreparably destroyed the lives of many, many more. As I said, despite the prosecution claiming that Porton killed her children to continue sex working, the more I look into this case, the less I agree with this statement. Even if this was part of the rationale, I think it's a minor part, as she was happily going along, doing whatever she was doing, and simply palming the children off on others. Instead, I think that Porton's motivation was, at a very basic level, financial. She killed her children because of money, but it's much more complicated than that. Let's start from the beginning. There's not much about Porton's early life, but it's clear that something was seriously wrong with her from a young age. Whether she was born this way or developed into this is unclear, but it's apparent that she was extremely antisocial and enjoyed hurting people. Underneath her behaviour, I think, was insecurity and extremely low self-esteem, with her using violence to make herself feel better about herself. Quickly, money became a way for her to feel good about herself. Money meant she could buy things, designer clothes, handbags, etc., to portray herself as successful, powerful, in order to hide from the damaged person she was. She began sleeping with anyone and everyone, and this is commonly an indicator of underlying issues with self-esteem, with people looking for validation, even briefly through sex, feeling wanted for that brief period of time, before having to confront how they actually feel about themselves. In order to avoid this, they keep having sex again and again and again, to avoid confronting their underlying issues. Porton realised she could combine the two things. Men would pay her for sex. Win-win. She'd get the validation she wanted, whilst also making money, which she could use to fund her lifestyle. I think getting money to maintain this was her sole purpose in life. She needed money in order to keep the shaky foundations of her pretend life from collapsing. She couldn't stand to acknowledge the person she actually was, or let the world see a glimpse of the damaged little girl she was. She was also horrendously spiteful. Any opportunity she could to hurt someone, she would take. And, by harming them, she felt powerful, reveling in other people's misery. Again, I'm sure this was a way for her to offset her own feelings of inadequacy. And this last reason is why she took her 2 children away from their father. Out of spite, she wanted him to suffer by not being able to see the children. They were simply pawns to be used. I think she thought little more than achieving this objective. She didn't think, how am I going to raise these children? I think when this dawned on her, she realised she was completely incapable. In court, Paulson admitted that she found parenting difficult. I think this was because she'd spent so many years being utterly self-absorbed that she had no ability to care for anyone but herself. If she was struggling, she could have contacted social services, or asked for help, or returned them to their father, or any number of things. But of course she didn't. That would make her look bad. Forget the fact she would have the children, it would mean that she'd have to admit fault. Her carefully crafted image would come crumbling down. So I firmly believe she resented the children, despite her putting them in that situation. They were at fault. They didn't benefit her in any way, and likely, she saw them as a drain on her resources. She was having to spend money on them and devote time to raising them, which took focus away from the most important thing in the world to her, herself. I think Paulson then realised that with these objects, because that's how she saw them, out of the way, there'd be more money for her, and sickeningly, I've no doubt that she was going to use the death of her children to rinse people for everything they were worth. We saw examples of this, saying she was struggling to cope when Lexi was in hospital, and needing money for petrol when taking Scarlett to hospital, and selling the children's clothes mere months after their death. The children's bodies were not released for burial until after Paulson's arrest in 2019, but I've absolutely no doubt whatsoever that she'd been in charge of their funerals. She would have set up as many fundraising pages as she could and begged for money from everywhere. She would have then paid for the cheapest funeral possible whilst pocketing the rest of the money, which she could then spend to keep on living a life which enabled her to avoid actually looking into the deep, dark hole of nothingness inside of her. I think she only didn't do this because she knew the police were circling, and I have no doubt that, as part of her sex work, the issue of how she was struggling still with the death of her 2 children and how desperate she was for money must have come up. This profile, I think, is more accurate. I would suggest that Louise Porton is what is known as a malignant narcissist, which is a severe condition which combines the traits of several different personality disorders, including narcissism, antisocial behaviour, aggression, and sadism, meaning essentially this type of individual will abuse others without remorse and often take great pleasure in this behaviour in order to get their own way. In the case of Louise Porton, she was willing to smother her own children, something that would have taken minutes, just so that she could maintain her lifestyle and continue to avoid the terror of admitting who she really was to herself and others. Saying that she did these things as the children got in the way of her sex life is a dangerous oversimplification. Louise Porton is a woman who will target, victimise, and kill anyone in order to get her own way. The chances of her being treated are, in my opinion, incredibly low. So, when she's released, I think she'll pose a serious danger to anyone who gets close to her. If she felt in the future that killing a child would help her make gain for herself, she would, without hesitation. But I think by the time she's released, which will be when she's in her 50s at the earliest, she will potentially change her MO. I can imagine her slithering herself into the lives of wealthy men and finding some way to take everything from them, potentially, if it benefited her, their lives. In this respect, I think that Louise Porton is an extremely dangerous predator who, in my humble opinion, isn't likely to ever be safe to be released. I just wanted to say something about this case. I read somewhere that concerns were raised to social services about Porton's parenting before the murders, but I have literally no information about what their involvement was, or the lack thereof. I'd be shocked, given her behaviour, that she didn't flag up on someone's radar. This is the sort of case I would expect to have been reviewed at a national level, and I'll keep an eye out in case there is a report. If I find out any more details, I'll do an update on this case. Anyway, Graham Frederick Young was born on the 7th of September 1947 to Fred and Bessie Young in Neasden,
Middlesex in the UK. He also had an older sister, Winifred. Young's mother died of tuberculosis when he was only 14 weeks old. Fred, overcome with grief, felt he could no longer look after the children, so Young was sent to live with his aunt and uncle, whilst his sister was sent to live with their grandparents. Young spent 2 years living with his aunt and uncle and became close to them. Eventually, his father recovered, remarried a woman called Molly, and the family reunited, moving to St Albans in the county of Hertfordshire, north of London. However, Young appeared to take separation from his aunt and uncle badly, and, from this point on, seemed to withdraw into himself and was described as, quote, a peculiar child who made no effort to socialise with other children. Young was a voracious reader and, from the time he could read, was never far from a book. He became fascinated with 3 particular topics: poisoners, Nazi Germany, and the occult. With regards to the first of these topics, Young became particularly fascinated with the crimes of Hawley Harvey Crippen, who murdered his wife Cora with poison in 1910 before fleeing to America, before he was captured, returned to England, and executed that same year. Young also cited Victorian poisoner William Palmer as being a particular hero of his. Palmer was an English doctor, dubbed the, quote, Prince of Poisoners, who was executed by hanging in 1856 for the murder of a friend to inherit his estate. However, he suspects of killing around 15 people by poisoning, including his wife, 4 of his infant children, his brother, and his mother-in-law. Young's research led him, at a very young age, to have developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of poisons. Young was also obsessed with Nazi Germany and would tell anyone who would listen how Hitler was, quote, misunderstood. He even took to making himself swastikas, including a brass medallion displaying this symbol, which he would proudly wear. With regards to the occult, Young appeared to fixate on this and developed a belief that he could receive power through sacrifice, and even allegedly tried to get local children involved in sacrificing cats for this purpose. Cats did disappear at an alarming frequency in the neighbourhood around Young's childhood home, and, whilst it was never determined to be him, I think this is likely. So you have a child with an in-depth knowledge of poisons who's obsessed with Hitler, the architect of a regime that exterminated millions of people through use of poison gas, as well as having a fixation on death and an obsession with famous poisoners. What could possibly go wrong? Unfortunately, it turned out a lot, and this was enabled by a bizarre quirk of society at this time. Specifically, between at least the 1800s and it would appear until the 1970s, people could freely purchase lethal doses of poison without any real oversight or questions being asked. Poisons such as arsenic were freely available in different forms, including rat poison and flypaper, and others you could buy just in their natural state. All one needed to obtain this was to walk into a chemist, buy the items, and then sign what is known as the, quote, poison register. This still exists to this day, but in fact this case led to a tightening in the sale of poisons. However, back in the day, people would, it appears from looking at other cases, just sign the register, often giving false details without anyone batting an eyelid. This was apparently the case in the 1960s, where at the age of 13 years old, Graham Young walked into several chemists and, due to his extensive knowledge of poisons, was able to convince them that he was 17 years old. This enabled Young to purchase lethal quantities of various poisons, including his 2 favourites, thallium and antimony, with him signing the poison register as Evie Adams. I'm not a chemist, but I've looked into both of these substances that Young purchased, and they are vicious, with them causing, amongst other things, extreme abdominal and muscular pain, vomiting, diarrhea, hallucinations, as well as causing serious damage to the internal organs and nervous system. Death could be quick or slow, depending on whether single large doses are administered or smaller doses are given over a longer period of time. But as the organs and bodily functions are disrupted, individuals can die in excruciating agony. Thallium is particularly lethal, and even touching it can be deadly. How much poison Young was able to purchase at the age of 13 is not explicitly stated, but it's estimated that he was able to purchase enough to kill 100 to 300 people. Young took these poisons and began experimenting with them, using a chemistry set that his father had bought him. but it's believed that Graham Young began poisoning others at around the age of 13, with him administering doses of poison to a child of a similar age called Christopher Williams. Christopher, I've read, was Young's only friend, and it was used as a type of guinea pig, with Young administering a cocktail of poisons over a protracted period of time, which meant he experienced vomiting, cramps, and headache. How he did this is unclear, but it appears that Young and Christopher would often exchange their sandwiches at lunchtime at school, so it's likely that Young laced these with poison. Christopher was lucky to survive, but it appears that Young was unsatisfied with this experience, as the poisoning meant that Christopher was off school, so he could not observe this experiment up close. Young needed subjects he could poison and then watch deteriorate, so he turned to his own family. In February 1961, still aged only 13, Graham Young began poisoning members of his own family. He first began by poisoning his stepmother, Molly Young, administering antimony to her drinks and food. This led to her suffering vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating stomach pains. In the next month, Fred Young, patriarch of the family, also suffered from similar stomach cramps, which would leave him bedbound for days at a time. In November 1961, Young's sister Winifred was given a cup of tea by her brother one morning, but found it tasted so sour she took one mouthful and then threw it away. An hour later, she was on a train to work, where she began to hallucinate. Members of the public had to help her when she collapsed at the train station, and an ambulance was called. Tests in hospital revealed she'd been poisoned. Fred suspected his son of having been responsible and searched his room where his chemistry set was located. However, Fred took no further action, aside from telling Young to be careful in the future when, quote, messing about with those bloody chemicals. It appears that over 1961, Young was administering small doses of poison, specifically antimony, to his sister, father, and stepmother. But in 1962, the main focus of his experiment was his stepmother, Molly. On the evening of the 21st of April 1962, Molly was found writhing in agony in the garden, with Young stood watching her, fascinated by her death throes. It transpired that Young had either got bored of the protracted nature of his current experiment or decided to escalate his behaviour and had poisoned Molly with a lethal dose of thallium the day before. Molly was taken to hospital, where she died in agony a few hours later. Her death was assigned to complications related to a car accident which she'd recently had, which I find inexplicable. Young suggested that Molly should be cremated, which occurred, so no further examination of her corpse could take place. Graham Young appeared to be fixated on harming as many people as possible, and at Molly's wake, he laced a mustard jar with poison, leading to at least one man becoming seriously ill. With Molly out of the way, Young continued poisoning his father and sister, and this only stopped when Fred was hospitalised in May 1962 after his attacks of vomiting and cramping became increasingly severe. Tests were run, and Fred was found to have been poisoned over months with antimony, and he was believed to be one dose away from death. However, Fred still appeared unable or unwilling to believe his son was to blame. It was his school that finally raised the alarm, after a teacher found vials of poison in his desk. The school had Young interviewed by a psychiatrist, posing as a careers advisor, and it became clear that Young was obsessed with poisons and had clearly used these substances to harm others. The school called the police, and on the 23rd of May 1962, Graham Young was arrested when he returned home from school. When Graham Young was arrested in May 1962, he was found in possession of vials of poison in his school blazer, and he freely admitted, apparently with great pride, to having poisoned his father, sister, a school friend, and his stepmother Molly, and that he deliberately administered a lethal dose to the latter, resulting in her death. Due to the cremation of Molly's body, there was no way to verify his claims that he had murdered her, and therefore he couldn't be charged with this. Instead, he was charged with 3 counts of, quote, malicious administration of a noxious thing to inflict grievous bodily harm. In July 1962, Graham Young appeared at the Old Bailey in London, where he pleaded guilty to the charges and was assessed by psychiatrists. 1. Dr. Christopher Fish,
testified in court that Young was a psychopath who had failed to, quote, develop a normal moral sense, and he felt that Young was extremely likely to reoffend. He also recounted a conversation with Young where he was unconcerned about the damage he had caused, but instead was upset about being unable to get his hands on his vials of poison, with him saying, quote, "I'm missing my antimony. I miss the power it gives me." The recommendation was that Graham Young should be sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital and remain there for a term of at least 15 years, with his release back into the community only being directed if he was no longer deemed a danger to society. So, at the age of just 14 years old, Graham Young became one of the youngest patients to ever enter Broadmoor. Interesting fact, the youngest patient ever to enter Broadmoor was a person called William Giles, who was sent there at the age of 10 in 1885.
After committing arson, he spent the rest of his life, 77 years in Broadmoor, dying there in 1962 aged 87. Graham Young is one of those rare people who is so dangerous there's literally no environment which can contain them and protect those around them. As an example, soon after coming to Broadmoor, a patient called John Berridge died an agonising death from cyanide poisoning. This was a man that Young had written about in his letters to his family, stating that John was annoying him with his snoring. So, Young decided to eliminate the issue. He took laurel bush leaves, of which there were large amounts in the locality, and which naturally contained cyanide, extracted this, and then used it to poison John. Young freely confessed that he killed John to staff at Broadmoor, but for some inexplicable reason, they marked his death as a suicide. I imagine this was just to avoid the hassle of an inquiry. However, this was not an isolated incident. On one occasion, bleach was found in staff's coffee, and in 1968, so 6 years into Graham Young's stay, industrial cleaner was found to have gone missing, and this was found in the communal tea urn used by approximately 100 people, but luckily before anyone had drunk from it. It appears that both staff and patients knew full well what Young was doing, and it stated that staff would jokingly tell patients, quote, "Unless you behave, I'll let Graham make your coffee." Young was also still fascinated with Nazism and walk around Broadmoor adorned with swastikas he'd made, including pendants and medallions. He would also continue to espouse the virtues of Hitler. Despite his behaviour in Broadmoor, including him confessing that he killed a fellow patient, his original suggested tariff of 15 years, and the fact that he clearly tried to poison others over the years, in 1970, Broadmoor psychiatrist Dr. Edgar Udwin wrote to the Home Secretary and recommended that Graham Young should be released as he was no longer a danger to society and, quote, no longer obsessed with poisons, violence and mischief. Cynically, I think this bizarre decision was potentially due to the fact that Young was causing so many issues in Broadmoor and they just wanted to get rid of him. Or perhaps Dr. Udwin was really crap at his job. Either way, in early 1971, after 8 years in Broadmoor and aged just 23, this dangerous psychopath was released from Broadmoor. Just prior to his release, he told a nurse, quote, "When I get out, I'm going to kill one person for every year I've spent in this place." This comment was considered a serious threat, noted down and put in Young's file, but was never acted upon. If you think that this is a calamity of failures, what happened next is even more staggering. As soon as Graham Young was released in early 1971, he appeared to go on a journey down memory lane, going to chemists that he bought poison from and proudly stating his name, and appearing to be disappointed when they did not receive him as some sort of celebrity. Similarly, Young approached his old school teachers and spoke to them about his time away, focusing more on telling them about his crimes as opposed to his rehabilitation. Again, Young appeared unhappy that he was not more infamous and that the world had apparently continued turning despite his absence. Within weeks of his release, Young had purchased his favourite poisons, thallium and antimony, from a chemist and began to poison people. He began with 34-year-old Trevor Speaks, who was a housemate at a hostel he was staying at in Slough, Berkshire. Soon after Young moved in, Trevor began to experience abdominal pains and sickness whenever he drank anything. Young said a glass of wine would help his symptoms, but this only made the sickness worse.
Trevor survived, but had severe abdominal pains for years. Around this same time, another man, whose name I cannot find, apparently had a drink with a man who looked exactly like Graham Young and who was obsessed with poisons. This man apparently became severely ill but survived, but eventually, years later, committed suicide because of the ongoing severe pain he experienced from being poisoned. In May 1971, Graham Young moved to Hertfordshire and applied for a job at a small firm called John Hadland Limited in the village of Bovington, which made photographic lenses. The company contacted Broadmoor for references and were apparently informed that Young was rehabilitated. However, Broadmoor did not tell the company that Young was a convicted poisoner, had admitted killing a fellow patient, and had made threats to kill people when he got out, so he was hired. Young's job included making and distributing hot drinks, and each employee had their own mug, so it was easier for him to target specific individuals. Young was described as a morose, unsociable man who would only become involved in conversations if they were on topics he was interested in, specifically war, Nazis, poison, and famous murderers. Aside from these interactions, he would keep himself to himself and barely speak to anyone unless he absolutely had to. Immediately, Young began poisoning his co-workers. Young began to poison 59-year-old Bob Eagle, his immediate superior. Bob was a World War II veteran and, within days of first meeting Young, had to take time off work with diarrhea, vomiting, and severe stomach pains. Bob's health improved when he left to go on holiday, but when he returned, as with his stepmother Molly all those years ago, Graham Young laced Bob's tea with a fatal dose of thallium. Bob's condition deteriorated quickly, resulting in him having profuse vomiting and diarrhea, as well as extreme pain in his abdomen and back. Bob was admitted to hospital and transferred to the intensive care unit. However, his organs shut down, and Bob died an agonizing death on the 7th of July 1971. His death was not considered suspicious. The callousness of Graham Young is demonstrated by his feigned concern for Bob, with him regularly calling the hospital to get updates on his condition. I have no doubt that this was his way of getting a sick thrill by getting updates about the agony that Bob was in and how his life was ebbing away. Young also poisoned at least 4 other co-workers, with his modus operandi being to slip poison into their tea or coffee. One of these people, Diana Smith, was poisoned when Young spiked her tea. Later, police found a diary entry where Young had written that Diana had, quote, irritated me yesterday, so I packed her off home with an attack of sickness. I only gave her something to shake her up. I now regret that I didn't give her a larger dose, capable of laying her up for a few days. Unfortunately, Young was able to avoid detection because, coincidentally, a stomach bug had been going around the local area, known as the, quote, Bovington bug, so it was assumed that the employees falling ill had succumbed to this virus. Before the truth could be revealed, 56-year-old local councillor and part-time employee at Hadland Limited, Fred Biggs, was targeted by Young, who began by slipping small doses of antimony into his drinks. Then, on the 30th of October 1971, Young put a massive dose of thallium into Fred's tea, and within 24 hours, he developed chest pains and had difficulty breathing. Fred was soon transferred to the intensive care unit in Whittington Hospital in North London, and its last few weeks on Earth were like something out of a nightmare. His nervous system began to shut down, so he could not speak or breathe on his own. He was in perpetual excruciating pain, and eventually his skin began to peel off. Fred eventually died on the 17th of November 1971, and again, poisoning was not suspected. Young was again reveling in his offending, calling the hospital and even Fred's wife to get updates on his condition. As with other psychopaths and narcissists, Graham Young couldn't help but find some way to brag about his behaviour, and his own arrogance was his undoing. Specifically, the day after Fred's death, the company doctor gathered all the staff and tried to reassure them due to the number of illnesses and deaths the company had had in such a short time. The doctor became concerned when Young began grilling him about thallium poisoning. Young's demeanour and his apparent expansive knowledge of poisons raised alarm bells, and the police were called. The police then looked into the situation and quickly found that the deaths and illnesses had started soon after Graham Young had started the company. They consulted with doctors who stated that the symptoms of those who had died and come unwell was likely as a result of deliberate poisoning. They also saw Young's criminal record and could see the reasons why he'd been sent to Broadmoor. Only then were the company informed of who Graham Young really was, but obviously by that point it was far too late. The police knew they had their man, and when they searched Graham Young's flat, they had all the evidence they needed. In particular, the most incriminating piece of evidence was a meticulous diary that Young had kept, in which he documented the progress of his, quote, patients, including dosages he had given them and resulting symptoms. He also wrote whether he was going to allow his victims to live or die. Also found in his property was enough poison to kill in excess of 300 people. In addition, it was found that Young had adorned his walls with pictures of Hitler and other Nazi leaders, as well as drawings of emaciated figures holding bottles labelled poison, clutching their throats. On November the 21st, 1971, Graham Young was finally arrested. Young gleefully confessed to poisoning and killing Bob Eagle and Fred Biggs, as well as poisoning 2 other people. He bragged that he committed the, quote, perfect murder by killing his stepmother Molly Young in 1962. Young was eventually charged with multiple offences, including 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder, and he was held in prison awaiting his day in court. So, remember, we had a psychiatrist who stated that Graham Young was no longer a danger to society, so he should be released, and in less than 10 months, he'd poisoned numerous people and murdered at least 2, and no one bothered to tell his employers that he was a poisoner whose modus operandi was to lace people's drinks. Absolutely mind-boggling. The evidence against Graham Young was overwhelming, not only due to his own confession, but the poisons found in his property and the fact that subsequently, thallium had been found in the internal organs of Fred Biggs and the cremated remains of Bob Eagle. However, it was clear he was intent on enjoying the spotlight and so pleaded not guilty to all offences, resulting in him going to trial at St Albans Crown Court, which started on the 19th of June 1972. Young took the stand clearly as a way to demonstrate just how clever he was, and he assisted his defence in poking holes in the prosecution's case. It appears that Young potentially believed his own superiority and his lies, with him writing to a cousin stating, quote, I stand a good chance of acquittal, for the prosecution case has a number of inherent weaknesses. A strong point in my favour is that I am not guilty of the charges. To no one's surprise, Graham Young was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment. I cannot find whether a minimum tariff was set, but I think it's likely that authorities wanted him to die behind bars, which, eventually, he did. So, by the age of 25, Graham Young was again behind bars, this time unlikely ever to be released. He was dubbed the teapot poisoner by the press, and it's clear that he revelled in his notoriety and demanded recognition in prison. In prison, Young continued to espouse his love of Hitler and would often grow a moustache in honour of his idol. He was hated by other prisoners. The one person he bonded with was Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, with the pair apparently bonding over their love of the Nazis. It's clear that evil attracts evil, and despite the remorselessness of Graham Young's offending, Ian Brady wrote that, quote, it was difficult not to empathise with Graham Young. I cannot think of a worse pairing than Ian Brady and Graham Young. The only positive of this story is that neither are amongst the living any longer. With Graham Young, on August the 1st, 1990, he was found dead in his cell at H&P Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight. He was 42 years old. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack. However, Young had no history of heart disease, which led people to speculate that his death was suspicious and that he may have been killed by other inmates or staff. However, I think a more likely conclusion is that Young found a way to poison himself, ending his own life in order to escape justice, his last act of control.
this is a fascinating case, as I don't think I've covered many people as cold and remorseless as Graham Young, and definitely not a case involving poison. Graham Young was, in my humble opinion, the epitome of a psychopath, a man who had no empathy or conscience for what he did. Young is, in many respects, an easier case to understand, as he made his motivations to the thinking quite obvious, with him stating, as already said, that he missed the power that the poisons gave him. And another insightful quote came from his final arrest where, when asked how he could justify killing human beings, he stated, quote, "I suppose I'd ceased to see them as people. At least, a part of me had. They were simply guinea pigs." Taking these comments together, I believe that Graham Young saw himself as some sort of god, and mere mortals akin to rats running around a maze, with him in ultimate control of their fate and destiny. Young saw himself as superior to everyone, and those around him as annoyances to be experimented upon and disposed of when they became an inconvenience. I think that Young's early fascination with Hitler and Nazis was driven by the sense of power that one man can have, and how this can be bent to kill others on a mass scale, and he was trying to replicate the behaviour of his idol, including dressing like him and even growing a similar moustache. He also replicated the mass extermination technique used by this regime. In terms of poisoning, I think that Graham Young probably thought he was born out of his time, and that he wished that he'd been born in a different time, in a different country, where he'd have willingly volunteered to be part of the final solution. However, as just one man, it's clear that Graham Young was intent on maiming and killing as many people as possible. Anyone was fair game, even his family members, and anyone who simply annoyed Young, even for the most trivial of reasons, including snoring, was deemed worthy of execution. It's clear that, whilst overestimating his intelligence, Graham Young had an astute intellect, and I think this is demonstrated by the nature of his offending, with him using poison, which needs skill to administer stealthily, and it's clear he administers specific dosages depending on whether he wished to maim or kill. I imagine that Young felt ecstatic about how he was getting away with his crimes, how he was hiding in plain sight, and no one was any the wiser. I mentioned during the intro of this video that Young had killed at least 4 people, including his stepmother, a patient he'd brought aboard, as well as the 2 workers at his last place of employment. However, how many people he actually killed is unclear, as it seems that the cause of death of all of the people he murdered were linked to natural causes until Young confessed. Clearly, as with the typical narcissist, Graham Young wanted praise and recognition for the work that he'd done, and I imagine he was holding back information to drip feed over the years whilst in prison. Maybe Graham Young wasn't getting the recognition he wanted and had become inconsequential, just another prisoner in the system, and that's why he took his own life. Or potentially he did indeed die of natural causes, but I find this unlikely. But, regardless of the nature of his passing, it's clear that Graham Young was an extremely dangerous and evil man, devoid of any humanity.